Part 1. The birth of terror. The year was 1231, and Pope Gregory IX was about to unleash one of history's most feared institutions upon medieval Europe, with the papal bull Excommunicamus. He formally established what would become known as the medieval Inquisition, a judicial system that would cast a shadow of fear across continents for centuries to come. This was not merely the creation of another church court. It was the birth of systematic terror disguised as divine justice. The historical context: a world in religious turmoil. To understand the emergence of the Inquisition, we must first grasp the complex religious and political landscape of 13th century Europe. The Catholic Church, at the height of its temporal power, faced unprecedented challenges to its authority. Across southern France, a Christian sect known as the Cathars or Albigensians had gained significant influence, preaching beliefs that directly contradicted core Catholic doctrines. They rejected the authority of the Pope, dismissed the sacraments, and believed in a dualistic universe where an evil god had created the material world. The Cathar heresy, as the Church labeled it, was not merely a theological dispute. It represented a fundamental threat to the Church's monopoly on salvation and, consequently, its vast political and economic power. Traditional methods of combating heresy, primarily through local bishops and secular authorities, had proven inadequate. The Church needed a more systematic, more frightening approach. The Dominican and Franciscan orders, newly formed and fiercely loyal to papal authority, provided the perfect solution. These mendicant friars, educated and mobile, could serve as papal inquisitors with authority that transcended local political boundaries. Unlike local clergy who might be influenced by regional politics or personal relationships, these inquisitors answered directly to Rome, making them both more effective and more terrifying. The legal foundation for this new institution drew heavily from Roman law, particularly the concept of crime and exceptum, exceptional crimes that justified exceptional procedures. Heresy was classified as the ultimate exceptional crime, worse than treason because it threatened not just earthly kingdoms but eternal salvation itself. This classification would justify methods that even medieval standards of justice found extreme. Official objectives versus the reality of power. The Church's official justification for the Inquisition was elegantly simple and morally compelling: to save souls from eternal damnation. Pope Gregory IX and his successors presented the inquisitors as spiritual physicians, diagnosing and treating the disease of heresy before it could spread and contaminate the faithful. The stated goal was not punishment but conversion, bringing lost sheep back to the true fold of Christ. Official documents from the period emphasized mercy and careful deliberation. The inquisitors were instructed to seek confessions, to give heretics opportunities to recant, and to impose penances rather than harsh punishments whenever possible. Death, the ultimate sanction, was reserved only for the most obstinate heretics who refused to abandon their errors even after patient instruction and multiple opportunities for repentance. This merciful facade, however, masked a far more complex and sinister reality. The Inquisition quickly became a powerful tool for consolidating papal authority, eliminating political opposition, and seizing the wealth of accused heretics. The process was designed to be virtually inescapable once initiated. The burden of proof was entirely on the accused, who had to prove their innocence rather than having their guilt established beyond reasonable doubt. More insidiously, the definition of heresy proved remarkably elastic. While initially focused on clear doctrinal deviations like Catharism, the scope gradually expanded to include any behavior or belief that could be construed as challenging church authority. Questioning certain Catholic doctrines, possessing forbidden books, practicing unusual devotions, or even expressing skepticism about miracle claims could all be interpreted as signs of heretical thinking. The economic incentives built into the system further corrupted its stated spiritual mission. The property of condemned heretics was confiscated, with portions going to the Church, the inquisitors themselves, and cooperative secular authorities. This created powerful financial motivations for accusations and convictions, transforming the pursuit of religious orthodoxy into a profitable enterprise. The geography of fear, where terror took root. The Inquisition did not emerge uniformly across Europe, but rather established itself strategically in regions where heretical movements were most active or where the Church's authority faced the greatest challenges. Southern France became the first major theater of inquisitorial activity, specifically targeting the Cathar strongholds in Languedoc and Toulouse. The choice of these regions was not accidental. The county of Toulouse and surrounding areas had developed a sophisticated urban culture with strong traditions of intellectual independence. The local nobility often protected heretics, either out of genuine religious conviction or because opposition to church authorities served their political interests against French royal expansion. The troubadour culture had fostered an environment where questioning authority, including religious authority, was more acceptable than in other parts of Europe. From these initial footholds in southern France, the Inquisition gradually expanded its reach. Northern Italian cities, with their merchant wealth and political independence, became the next major targets. Cities like Milan, Florence, and Venice, despite their nominal Catholic allegiance, harbored various forms of religious dissent and maintained complex relationships with papal authority that made them suspect. The establishment of inquisitorial tribunals followed a consistent pattern. Inquisitors would arrive in a city or region with impressive credentials and considerable ceremony, emphasizing their divine mission and papal authority. They would immediately establish a period of grace, typically lasting 30 to 40 days, during which heretics could voluntarily confess and receive relatively lenient treatment. This initial mercy served a dual purpose. It encouraged voluntary confessions that provided intelligence about local heretical networks, and it created the impression of reasonable, measured justice. However, the geography of inquisitorial power was not merely about physical locations, but about creating a psychological landscape of fear. The mere rumor that inquisitors might arrive in a region was often sufficient to trigger a wave of denunciations, preemptive confessions, and flight. Communities that had lived peacefully with religious diversity for generations suddenly found neighbors turning against neighbors, afraid that association with suspected heretics might bring down the terrible machinery of inquisitorial justice upon themselves. The first victims and initial methods. The earliest victims of the medieval Inquisition were primarily Cathars from southern France, but the systematic nature of their persecution established patterns that would define inquisitorial procedure for centuries. Unlike earlier, more spontaneous outbreaks of religious violence, the Inquisition introduced a methodical, bureaucratic approach to the identification and elimination of heresy. The initial methods developed by the first inquisitors, particularly Conrad of Marburg in Germany and Robert Le Bougre in France, combined psychological manipulation with legal innovation in ways that made resistance extremely difficult. The process typically began with a public sermon, in which the inquisitor would explain his mission and call upon the faithful to identify heretics in their midst. This public theater served multiple purposes. It legitimized the inquisitor's presence, educated the population about the signs of heresy, and created enormous social pressure for denunciation. The use of secret witnesses became one of the most terrifying aspects of early inquisitorial procedure. Unlike secular courts, where accusers had to face their targets publicly, inquisitorial trials allowed anonymous denunciation. The accused were not informed of their accusers' identities, making it impossible to assess the credibility or motivations of witnesses. This anonymity encouraged denunciations by removing the fear of retaliation, but also opened the door to false accusations motivated by personal grudges, business disputes, or simple malice. Conrad of Marburg's campaign in Germany between 1231 and 1233 demonstrated both the power and the dangers of these new methods. Conrad, armed with papal authority and assisted by a network of lay informants, moved through the Rhineland identifying and condemning heretics with unprecedented efficiency. His methods were so extreme that they provoked resistance even from church authorities. When Conrad accused powerful nobles and high-ranking clergy of heresy, his career came to an abrupt end. He was assassinated by unknown attackers in 1233. Robert Le Bougre's activities in northern France revealed another disturbing pattern: the tendency of former heretics to become the most zealous persecutors. Robert had himself been a Cathar before converting to Catholicism and joining the Dominican order. His intimate knowledge of heretical practices made him an effective inquisitor, but his personal history also drove him to prove his orthodoxy through extreme measures. In 1239, he condemned 183 people to death in a single day at Montheim, an event that shocked even medieval sensibilities accustomed to religious violence. These early inquisitors developed interrogation techniques that would become standard throughout the institution's history. They understood that physical torture, while sometimes employed, was less effective than psychological pressure. The inquisitorial prison itself became a tool of persuasion, isolation, uncertainty about one's fate, and the knowledge that confession was the only path to any hope of mercy gradually wore down even the most determined resistance. The doctrine of purgatio canonica required accused heretics to clear themselves not only of the specific charges against them, but to demonstrate their general orthodoxy through detailed testimony about their beliefs and practices. This requirement transformed every trial into a comprehensive examination of the defendant's entire spiritual life, making it virtually impossible to emerge completely unscathed. Perhaps most insidiously, the early inquisitors perfected the art of extracting not just confessions but denunciations of others. A heretic seeking mercy was expected to provide information about fellow heretics, creating a cascade effect that could destroy entire communities. This system turned a natural human desire for survival into a weapon against religious dissent, making every confession a potential source of new victims. The success of these early methods in eliminating the Cathar heresy demonstrated to church authorities that systematic, bureaucratic persecution was far more effective than spontaneous violence or traditional legal procedures. The techniques developed in 13th century France will be refined and exported throughout Catholic Europe, creating a template for religious oppression that would persist for centuries. By 1250, less than 20 years after its formal establishment, the medieval Inquisition had fundamentally altered the religious landscape of Western Europe. The message was clear: dissent from Catholic orthodoxy would not be tolerated, and the Church possessed both the will and the means to identify and eliminate heretics with terrifying efficiency. The age of religious terror had begun, and survival would require not just faith, but cunning, luck, and an understanding of just how dangerous it had become to think differently in medieval Christendom. Part 2. The network of surveillance. By the mid-13th century, the Inquisition had evolved beyond a simple judicial institution into something far more insidious, a comprehensive surveillance network that penetrated every layer of medieval society. This was not merely a court system that waited for crimes to be reported. It was an active intelligence apparatus that sought out heresy through systematic espionage, turning communities against themselves and transforming the very fabric of social trust into a weapon of religious control. The anonymous denunciation system, terror without face. The cornerstone of inquisitorial surveillance was the anonymous denunciation system, a mechanism so psychologically devastating that its effects extended far beyond its actual implementation. Unlike traditional medieval justice, where accusers faced their targets in open court and bore responsibility for their claims, the Inquisition deliberately concealed the identity of those who reported suspected heretics. This anonymity was not an oversight or administrative convenience. It was a calculated strategy designed to maximize fear and encourage betrayal. The system operated through multiple channels, each designed to capture different types of intelligence. Primary among these were the formal denunciation sessions that accompanied every inquisitorial visit to a community. When inquisitors arrived in a town or region, they would announce a tempus gratiae, a period of grace lasting typically 30 to 40 days during which heretics could confess voluntarily and receive lighter penalties. Simultaneously, they would call upon all faithful Catholics to report any knowledge of heretical activity, emphasizing that failure to denounce known heretics was itself a form of complicity that could result in excommunication or worse. These public calls for denunciation created immediate social pressure, but the anonymous nature of the reports transformed ordinary community tensions into potential death sentences. Personal disputes over property, business competition, family feuds, romantic rivalries, or simple personality conflicts could now be weaponized through accusations of heresy. A merchant facing business competition might denounce a rival for making suspicious comments about church doctrine. A spurned lover could report their former partner for possessing forbidden books. A tenant farmer might accuse a harsh landlord of secretly practicing Jewish rituals. The inquisitors understood perfectly well that many denunciations were motivated by personal animosity rather than genuine religious concern, but this knowledge did not diminish the system's effectiveness. It enhanced it. Every denunciation, regardless of its motivation, had to be investigated, creating a climate where any unusual behavior, any deviation from rigid orthodoxy, any expression of independent thought could be interpreted as evidence of heretical tendencies. The administrative procedures surrounding anonymous denunciation were deliberately designed to amplify uncertainty and fear. Accusers were required to provide detailed testimony about what they had witnessed or heard, but they were never confronted by the accused or required to defend their claims publicly. The accused, meanwhile, were informed that charges had been brought against them, but were never told who had made the accusations or what specific evidence had been presented. This asymmetry made defense almost impossible and created a paranoid atmosphere where everyone was potentially both surveilled and surveilling. The Inquisition's record-keeping system, remarkably sophisticated for its time, ensured that denunciations were never forgotten. Detailed files were maintained on every person mentioned in testimony, even those who were never formally charged. These records followed individuals throughout their lives and could be reopened decades later if new suspicions arose. A casual comment about church practices, reported by an anonymous witness and filed away, might surface years later as evidence of persistent heretical tendencies when combined with new accusations. How neighbors became enemies, the destruction of social trust. The transformation of neighborly relations under inquisitorial surveillance represents one of the most profound social changes of the medieval period. Communities that functioned for generations on the basis of mutual trust, shared obligations, and collective solidarity found themselves fractured by suspicion and fear. The Inquisition did not merely punish heretics. It systematically destroyed the social bonds that made community life possible. This destruction began with the redefinition of neighborly duty. Traditional medieval communities operated on principles of mutual aid and collective responsibility. Neighbors helped each other during harvest time, shared resources during periods of scarcity, and collectively defended against external threats. The Inquisition perverted these communal bonds by redefining true neighborly love as the obligation to report suspected heresy, even when such reporting would destroy families and friendships. The process was gradual but inexorable. Initial denunciations typically targeted individuals who were already marginal to the community, recent immigrants, religious minorities, or those engaged in unusual occupations. These early accusations created a false sense of security among the mainstream population, who convinced themselves that cooperation with inquisitors would protect them from suspicion. However, as the investigation process unfolded, the network of accusations inevitably expanded to include more and more community members. The interrogation of accused heretics invariably produced new names. Under the enormous pressure of inquisitorial questioning, desperate to prove their orthodoxy and earn mercy, defendants would provide information about others who had made suspicious comments, attended questionable gatherings, or possessed forbidden materials. Each confession became a source of new investigations, creating a cascade effect that could engulf entire communities. Perhaps most devastatingly, the Inquisition exploited existing social tensions to accelerate the breakdown of trust. Every community harbored underlying conflicts, disputes over land rights, marriages across social boundaries, economic competition, or generational tensions between traditional and innovative approaches to work or worship. Inquisitors, trained to read social dynamics, would identify these fault lines and exploit them, encouraging denunciations that follow predictable patterns of existing animosity. The impact on family relationships was particularly severe. The Inquisition explicitly encouraged family members to denounce each other, framing such betrayals as acts of religious devotion rather than violations of natural affection. Husbands were encouraged to report wives who seemed insufficiently devout, parents to denounce children who asked too many questions about religious doctrine, and children to inform on parents who maintained suspicious customs or expressed heterodox opinions. The psychological toll of this systematic betrayal cannot be overstated. Medieval society was organized around elaborate networks of personal loyalty and mutual obligation. The Inquisition surveillance system required individuals to choose between these traditional bonds and their own safety, creating a form of moral torture that complemented the physical brutality of inquisitorial prisons. Many communities never recovered from this trauma, remaining permanently fractured even after inquisitorial activity ended. The role of the Holy Office familiars, institutionalized espionage. While anonymous denunciation provided the Inquisition with occasional intelligence, the institution's most effective surveillance tool was the systematic recruitment of familiars, lay collaborators who provided ongoing intelligence about their communities in exchange for social status, legal privileges, and protection from suspicion. The familiar system represented the formalization of espionage, transforming surveillance from a sporadic activity into a permanent feature of social life. Familiars were recruited from all levels of society, but the Inquisition showed particular interest in individuals who occupied strategic positions for gathering intelligence. Merchants, tavern keepers, servants in wealthy households, teachers, and craftsmen were all valuable recruits because their occupations provided access to private conversations and confidential information. The diversity of familiar recruitment ensured that no social space remained beyond inquisitorial surveillance. The selection process for familiars was carefully managed to maximize their effectiveness while minimizing the risk of exposure. Potential recruits were typically approached privately by existing familiars or by inquisitorial officials who emphasized both the religious importance of the work and the personal benefits of cooperation. The Inquisition was particularly skilled at identifying individuals who were vulnerable to recruitment. Those facing economic difficulties, legal troubles, or social marginalization could be offered solutions to their problems in exchange for their services. Once recruited, familiars received extensive training in surveillance techniques and the identification of suspicious behavior. They were taught to recognize the signs of various heresies, to remember and report conversations accurately, and to cultivate relationships that would provide access to private information. This training was often disguised as religious instruction, allowing familiars to develop their skills while maintaining their cover as particularly devout Catholics. The familiar network operated on multiple levels simultaneously. Some familiars were tasked with general surveillance, reporting anything unusual they observed in their daily interactions. Others were assigned specific targets, individuals already under suspicion who required closer monitoring. The most skilled familiars were used for infiltration operations, establishing relationships with suspected heretical communities to gather detailed intelligence about their beliefs, practices, and membership. The privileges granted to familiars made recruitment attractive while also serving to protect the institution's intelligence assets. Familiars received special legal protections, including the right to carry weapons in many jurisdictions where such privileges were restricted, exemption from certain taxes and civic obligations, and the right to have their legal cases heard in ecclesiastical rather than secular courts. These privileges not only compensated familiars for their services, but also provided them with powerful incentives to maintain their loyalty to the Inquisition. The familiar system created a parallel power structure within medieval communities, one that operated largely in secret, but wielded enormous influence over social and political life. Familiars often used their positions to advance their own interests, leveraging their connections to the Inquisition to settle personal scores, gain business advantages, or climb the social ladder. This corruption of the system was well known to inquisitorial officials, who tolerated and even encouraged it as a means of maintaining familiar loyalty. The psychological impact of the familiar system extended far beyond the actual number of individuals involved. Because the identity of familiars was kept secret, every member of the community became potentially suspect. The helpful neighbor who inquired about one's religious practices, the merchant who asked casual questions about one's reading habits, the servant who seemed unusually interested in private conversations. Any of these individuals might be reporting to the Inquisition. Social paranoia, when no one could be trusted, the cumulative effect of anonymous denunciation and systematic surveillance was the creation of a state of social paranoia that fundamentally altered the character of medieval life. This was not merely individual anxiety about personal safety, but collective breakdown of the basic trust that made social interaction possible. Communities under inquisitorial surveillance developed elaborate strategies for navigating daily life, while minimizing the risk of denunciation, transforming ordinary social interaction into a complex performance of orthodoxy. The most immediate manifestation of this paranoia was the careful monitoring of speech. Conversations that had once flowed naturally became stilted and artificial as individuals learned to avoid any topic that might be construed as religiously suspect. Casual criticism of church practices, expressions of doubt about particular doctrines, or even innocent questions about theological matters became dangerous territory. The famous medieval hospitality towards strangers disappeared as communities realized that unknown visitors might be inquisitorial agents gathering intelligence. Family life was not immune to this transformation. Parents became cautious about what they taught their children, knowing that innocent repetition of heterodox ideas could lead to denunciation. Children learned to be suspicious of their own relatives, understanding that family loyalty might conflict with religious duty. Marriage negotiations began to include careful investigation of potential partners' religious backgrounds, as alliance with a suspect family could bring entire lineages under suspicion. Economic relationships suffered particularly severe disruption. Business partnerships, traditionally sealed with personal trust and mutual obligation, became exercises in mutual surveillance. Merchants traveling between communities carried not only goods but potentially dangerous information about religious practices in different regions. Craft guilds, one centers of both professional training and social solidarity, became potential sources of denunciation as masters and apprentices monitored each other for signs of religious deviation. The paranoia extended beyond interpersonal relationships to encompass all forms of cultural expression. Literature, art, music, and even architecture came under scrutiny as potential vehicles for heretical ideas. Books became particularly dangerous possessions, as ownership of forbidden texts was clear evidence of heretical sympathies. Many families destroyed their libraries rather than risk being caught with suspicious materials, leading to an immense loss of medieval intellectual culture. Religious observance itself became a source of anxiety rather than comfort. Attending church services became a performance of orthodoxy rather than an expression of genuine faith, as individuals understood that their behavior was being monitored for signs of insufficient devotion. Private religious practices had to be carefully calibrated. Too much personal piety might suggest familiarity with forbidden mystical traditions, while too little might indicate lack of genuine faith. The impact on intellectual life was devastating. Universities, once centers of vibrant theological debate, became cautious and conformist as scholars understood that innovative thinking could be interpreted as heretical deviation. The great medieval tradition of rational inquiry into religious questions atrophied under the pressure of surveillance, replaced by rote repetition of approved doctrines. Perhaps most tragically, the surveillance system created its own momentum, generating the very behaviors it claimed to detect. Under constant scrutiny and pressure, some individuals did develop heterodox beliefs or engage in secretive religious practices, not because they were initially heretical, but because the experience of persecution led them to question the system that oppressed them. The Inquisition surveillance network thus became a self-fulfilling prophecy, creating the descent it claimed to suppress. By the late 13th century, the surveillance network had achieved its primary objective: the creation of society where religious conformity was maintained not primarily through conviction, but through fear. The price of this achievement was the destruction of medieval community life, the suppression of intellectual inquiry, and the transformation of religious faith from a source of comfort and meaning into an instrument of social control. The network of surveillance had succeeded in identifying heretics, but in the process, it had made heretics of them all. Part 3. The preferred targets. While the Inquisition surveillance network cast suspicion broadly across medieval society, certain groups found themselves disproportionately targeted by inquisitorial attention. These preferred targets were not chosen randomly, but represented strategic priorities for the Church's campaign to consolidate religious and political control. Understanding who was targeted and why reveals a complex intersection of religious doctrine, social prejudice, and political calculation that drove inquisitorial persecution. Converted Jews, new Christians, and their survival strategies. Among all the groups targeted by the Inquisition, none faced more systematic and sustained persecution than converted Jews, known as conversos or new Christians. This persecution was particularly tragic because these individuals had already made the ultimate sacrifice demanded by medieval Christian society. They had abandoned their ancestral faith and converted to Christianity, often under duress. Yet rather than ensuring their safety, conversion merely transformed them into a new category of suspect, forever marked by their Jewish origins and subjected to constant scrutiny for signs of religious backsliding. The targeting of conversos revealed the fundamental contradictions at the heart of medieval Christian attitudes toward religious conversion. While the Church officially celebrated conversion as a triumph of true faith over error, In practice, the sincerity of Jewish converts was constantly questioned. This suspicion was rooted partly in genuine religious concerns. Many conversions had indeed been forced or performed for social and economic advantage rather than spiritual conviction. But it also reflected deeper cultural prejudices that refused to accept that Jews could ever truly become Christians. The concept of limpieza de sangre, purity of blood, that developed in Spain during the 15th century crystallized these prejudices into formal doctrine. This principle held that Jewish ancestry, regardless of sincere conversion, created an inherent predisposition toward heretical thinking that could persist for generations. New Christians were thus subjected to genealogical investigations that traced their family histories back multiple generations, seeking evidence of Jewish ancestry that would justify continued suspicion and discrimination. The survival strategies developed by converso communities were sophisticated and varied, reflecting both their educational advantages and their desperate circumstances. Many converso families had been among the intellectual and economic elite of Jewish communities before conversion, bringing considerable resources and knowledge to their struggle for survival. They understood that mere outward conformity to Christian practices would not be sufficient. They needed to demonstrate exceptional piety and orthodoxy to deflect suspicion. One common strategy was the cultivation of prominent positions within Christian institutions. Conversos sought ordination as priests, appointment to university positions, and integration into religious orders, calculating that such roles would provide both protection and proof of their genuine faith. This strategy achieved notable successes. Many conversos rose to high positions in the church hierarchy, but it also created new vulnerabilities, as their prominence made them more visible targets for those who questioned their sincerity. Educational achievement became another crucial survival tool. Converso families invested heavily in providing their children with the best possible education, understanding that intellectual accomplishment could offer both social advancement and protection from persecution. Many of the period's most distinguished scholars, theologians, and scientists came from converso backgrounds, including figures like Pablo de Santa Maria, who became Bishop of Burgos, and Juan de Torquemada, who ironically became one of the most influential inquisitorial theorists. However, this very intellectual success created additional suspicions. Converso's facility with languages, their knowledge of Hebrew texts, and their sophisticated theological arguments were often interpreted as evidence of continued Jewish learning and, by extension, Jewish sympathies. The Inquisition developed elaborate tests designed to detect Judaizing behavior, secret adherence to Jewish practices that focused particularly on dietary habits, Sabbath observance, and knowledge of Hebrew prayers. Family networks provided both strength and vulnerability for converso communities. Extended family connections offered mutual support, financial assistance, and early warning of inquisitorial investigations. Marriage alliances between converso families created powerful economic and social networks that could provide protection and advancement opportunities. However, these same family connections meant that the arrest of one family member could trigger investigations of entire kinship networks, turning family loyalty into a liability. The most sophisticated converso survival strategy involved the deliberate cultivation of Christian cultural capital. Families would commission religious artwork for their homes, patronize Christian charitable institutions, and publicly demonstrate their devotion through elaborate religious observances. Some converso families became known for their exceptional piety, hoping that conspicuous devotion would shield them from suspicion. This performance of Christianity, while sometimes genuine, created enormous psychological stress as individuals struggled to maintain authentic spiritual lives while constantly monitoring their own behavior for signs that might be misinterpreted. Moors and their secret practices. The targeting of Moors, Mudéjars, and later Moriscos by the Inquisition represented a different set of challenges and survival strategies. Unlike Jews, who shared certain theological foundations with Christianity, Muslims came from a completely different religious tradition, making their integration into Christian society even more complex, and their survival strategies necessarily more elaborate. The situation of Moors under Christian rule varied significantly by region and historical period. In areas recently conquered from Muslim control, such as Granada after 1492, large Muslim populations were initially allowed to maintain their religious practices under negotiated surrender agreements. However, These protections were gradually eroded as political circumstances changed and religious tolerance gave way to demands for conformity. The forced conversions of Muslims, particularly in Spain during the early 16th century, created communities of Moriscos, converted Moors, whose situation paralleled that of conversos but with additional complications. Islamic religious law, unlike Judaism, contained explicit provisions for practicing faith in secret under conditions of persecution taqiyya, which provided theological justification for the very behaviors that inquisitors sought to detect and punish. Morisco survival strategies often centered on the preservation of Islamic cultural practices in forms that could be disguised or explained away as Christian customs. Arabic language maintenance was crucial for preserving religious knowledge, but also created enormous risks. Morisco communities developed sophisticated systems for teaching Arabic secretly, often disguising religious instruction as secular education in practical skills like mathematics or medicine. Architectural modifications to homes allowed for secret Islamic religious observances. Morisco houses often contained hidden spaces where religious materials could be concealed and where private prayers could be performed without detection. The orientation of these spaces toward Mecca, the installation of water systems for ritual purification, and the creation of concealed libraries of Arabic texts all required careful planning and constant vigilance. The preservation of Islamic dietary laws presented particular challenges, as these restrictions were well known to Christian authorities and easily monitored. Morisco families developed elaborate strategies for maintaining halal practices while appearing to conform to Christian customs. This might involve the secret slaughter and preparation of animals according to Islamic law, the concealment of pork avoidance through claims of health concerns, or the development of alternative explanations for fasting during Ramadan. Marriage practices became another crucial area where Islamic traditions had to be preserved in secret. Islamic marriage contracts, religious ceremonies, and inheritance practices continued in Morisco communities, but had to be disguised as Christian customs or conducted in complete secrecy. This dual system of marriage, Christian ceremonies for public consumption, and Islamic rituals for spiritual validity, required elaborate coordination and created additional opportunities for denunciation. Protestants and freethinkers. The emergence of Protestant movements in the 16th century created new categories of targets for inquisitorial persecution. Unlike conversos and Moriscos, who were suspected of maintaining non-Christian religious practices, Protestants were Christians whose theological disagreements with Catholic doctrine made them heretics in the technical sense. Protestant survival strategies varied considerably depending on the specific nature of their beliefs and the intensity of persecution in their regions. Some Protestant communities attempted to maintain their faith through careful doctrinal concealment, attending Catholic services while privately maintaining Protestant theological positions. This approach required sophisticated knowledge of the theological differences between Catholic and Protestant teaching and the ability to navigate public religious observance without compromising private conviction. Underground Protestant networks developed elaborate systems for distributing forbidden texts, conducting secret religious services, and maintaining communication with co-religionists in other regions. These networks often relied on merchants, students, and other travelers who could move between communities without attracting suspicion. The printing press, while creating new opportunities for the spread of Protestant ideas, also created new vulnerabilities as possession of Protestant texts became clear evidence of heretical sympathies. Free thinkers and intellectual dissidents faced perhaps the most complex survival challenges because their heterodoxy was often more subtle and philosophical than that of religious minorities. These individuals might question particular Catholic doctrines, express interest in classical philosophical traditions that challenge Christian teaching, or simply demonstrate too much intellectual independence for inquisitorial comfort. Survival for free thinkers often required the development of sophisticated strategies for expressing dissenting ideas in coded or indirect forms. Academic writing, literary works, and even artistic expression had to be carefully crafted to avoid obvious heretical statements, while still advancing intellectual positions that challenged orthodox thinking. This created a rich tradition of esoteric writing and symbolic expression that allowed dissenting ideas to survive and spread despite inquisitorial censorship. Women accused of witchcraft and heresy. Women represented a unique category of inquisitorial targets. facing persecution that combined religious suspicion with deeply rooted gender prejudices. The association of women with witchcraft and supernatural practices created particular vulnerabilities, as traditional female roles in healing, midwifery, and folk religious practices could easily be reinterpreted as evidence of diabolical involvement. The targeting of women for witchcraft accusations revealed the intersection of religious and social anxieties about female autonomy and power. Women who demonstrated unusual independence, whether economic, intellectual, or social, were particularly vulnerable to accusations. Widows who managed their own property, women who practiced healing arts, and those who showed too much religious enthusiasm or too little orthodox piety all faced heightened scrutiny. Survival strategies for women accused of witchcraft were often limited by their restricted legal and social status. Unlike male defendants who might have political connections, economic resources, or educational advantages to draw upon, women typically had to rely on family networks and community support that could be easily undermined by accusations of supernatural involvement. Some women survived by carefully managing their public personas, avoiding behaviors that might be interpreted as evidence of supernatural knowledge or power. This might involve abandoning traditional healing practices, limiting their participation in community religious activities, or cultivating relationships with powerful male protectors who could vouch for their orthodoxy. The gender nature of witchcraft accusations also created opportunities for survival through the manipulation of gender expectations. Women who could successfully present themselves as appropriately submissive, pious, and dependent might escape suspicion, while those who challenged traditional gender roles faced increased vulnerability. The targeting of these diverse groups, conversos, Moriscos, Protestants, freethinkers, and women accused of witchcraft, reveals the comprehensive nature of inquisitorial control. The Inquisition was not merely concerned with doctrinal purity, but with the elimination of all forms of diversity, independence, and dissent that might challenge the established order. The survival strategies developed by these targeted communities, while often successful in individual cases, could never fully overcome the systematic nature of the persecution they faced. Their stories reveal both the resilience of the human spirit under extreme pressure and the devastating effectiveness of institutionalized intolerance. Part 4. The Inquisitorial Process. The machinery of inquisitorial justice was designed with chilling efficiency to break the human spirit long before any formal verdict was reached. Unlike secular courts that sought to determine guilt or innocence through evidence and testimony, the inquisitorial process operated on the assumption that accusations were fundamentally valid. The only question was whether the accused would confess their crimes and repent, or persist in their heretical obstinacy until harsher measures became necessary. This system transformed arrest, imprisonment, and interrogation into instruments of psychological warfare, designed to extract confessions regardless of actual guilt or innocence. The arrest, how it happened, and where the accused were taken. The arrest of suspected heretics was carefully orchestrated to maximize psychological impact while minimizing the possibility of resistance or escape. Unlike modern criminal arrests that followed standardized procedures, inquisitorial arrests were tailored to the specific circumstances of each case and the perceived danger posed by the accused. The timing, location, and manner of arrest were all calculated to create maximum disruption and fear, both for the individual being taken and for the community witnessing the event. Most arrests occurred during the pre-dawn hours, when targets were most vulnerable and least likely to flee or resist. Inquisitorial officers, accompanied by armed guards and local officials, would surround the suspect's residence while the family slept. The knock on the door came with unmistakable authority, heavy, repeated, and impossible to ignore. When the door opened, there was no opportunity for negotiation or delay. The arrest warrant, bearing the seal of the Holy Office, was read aloud in Latin, regardless of whether the accused understood the language, and the individual was immediately taken into custody. The psychological impact of these dawn raids extended far beyond the immediate target. Family members were forced to watch helplessly as their loved one was led away, often without being told when or if they would see them again. Neighbors, awakened by the commotion, would peer from their windows to witness yet another member of their community disappearing into the inquisitorial system. These public arrests served as powerful reminders of the Inquisition's reach and the futility of resistance. The locations chosen for arrest were also significant. The Inquisition preferred to take suspects from their homes, where they felt most secure, and where the contrast between domestic safety and institutional power was most stark. However, arrests also occurred in churches during religious services, at markets during business transactions, and even at social gatherings, demonstrating that no space was sacred or safe from inquisitorial authority. The violation of these traditionally secure spaces amplified the psychological impact of the arrest and reinforced a message that the Inquisition's power transcended all normal social boundaries. Property seizure accompanied every arrest, ostensibly to prevent the concealment or destruction of evidence, but actually serving as both punishment and incentive for accusation. Officers would immediately inventory all possessions, searching for forbidden books, suspicious correspondence, or religious artifacts that might indicate heretical practices. This property remained under inquisitorial control throughout the trial process, with family members often left destitute regardless of the eventual verdict. The economic devastation caused by property seizure served as an additional form of pressure, as accused individuals understood that their family survival might depend on their cooperation with inquisitorial demands. Transportation to inquisitorial facilities was designed to further demoralize and disorient the accused. Prisoners were typically bound and hooded, preventing them from seeing their route or destination. This blindfolding served practical purposes. It prevented escape attempts and protected the secrecy of inquisitorial locations, but also had profound psychological effects. The loss of sight, combined with the stress of arrest and the uncertainty of their destination, created a state of helpless disorientation that persisted long after the hood was removed. The choice of detention facility varied depending on perceived importance of the case and the resources available to local inquisitorial offices. High-profile suspects might be taken to purpose-built inquisitorial prisons, while less significant cases might be confined in adapted monastery cells, municipal jails, or private houses requisitioned for inquisitorial use. Regardless of the specific location, all inquisitorial detention facilities shared certain characteristics designed to maximize psychological pressure while maintaining the legal fiction that prisoners were being held for their own spiritual benefit rather than as punishment. The secret prisons and their inhumane conditions. The architecture of inquisitorial prisons was itself a form of torture, designed to create an environment of total isolation, uncertainty, and despair. Unlike secular prisons that were often noisy, crowded places where inmates could communicate with each other and maintain some connection to the outside world. Inquisitorial facilities were engineered to destroy all sense of community and hope. Every aspect of these buildings, from their location to their internal design, served the ultimate goal of breaking the prisoner's will to resist. Most inquisitorial prisons were located within or adjacent to religious buildings, reinforcing the message that the prisoner's suffering was divinely sanctioned. The irony of being tortured in the shadow of churches and monasteries was not lost on the accused, many of whom had been devout Catholics before their arrest. The bells that marked the hours of prayer served as constant reminders of the religious community from which they had been excluded, while the proximity of sacred spaces made their own degradation seem all the more profound. The cells themselves were studies in calculated deprivation. Individual cells were typically small, windowless chambers that provided barely enough space for a person to lie down. The walls were thick stone that blocked most external sound, creating an oppressive silence broken only by the prisoner's own breathing and heartbeat. This acoustic isolation was psychologically devastating, as humans are fundamentally social beings who derive emotional stability from environmental sounds that connect them to the broader world of life and activity. Lighting in inquisitorial cells was minimal and carefully controlled. Small, high windows or narrow slots might provide barely enough light to distinguish day from night, but never enough to read, write, or engage in any meaningful activity. This perpetual twilight served multiple purposes. It prevented prisoners from maintaining normal circadian rhythms, making them more susceptible to disorientation and depression. It made it impossible to engage in intellectual activities that might provide psychological escape, and created a liminal environment that seemed to exist outside normal time and space. The furnishing of cells was deliberately minimal and uncomfortable. A straw mattress that was rarely changed, a wooden bucket for waste, and perhaps a small wooden stool comprised the entire contents of most cells. The lack of personal possessions or comfort items served to strip away the prisoner's sense of individual identity and social status. Wealthy merchants and learned scholars found themselves reduced to the same basic level of subsistence as the poorest peasants, reinforcing their powerlessness and dependence on their captors. Temperature control was used as another instrument of pressure. Cells were often deliberately kept too cold in winter and stifling hot in summer, with no means for prisoners to adjust their environment. The constant physical discomfort prevented restful sleep and clear thinking, while the inability to control even the most basic aspects of their environment reinforced the prisoners' total dependence on their captors' will. Food in inquisitorial prisons was provided at subsistence levels, calculated to maintain life while creating constant hunger and weakness. Meals typically consisted of bread, thin gruel, and occasional scraps of vegetables or meat. The poor quality and insufficient quantity of food served multiple purposes. It weakened prisoners physically, making them less capable of resistance. It created a state of constant preoccupation with basic survival that made complex thinking difficult, and it established food as a privilege that could be withdrawn or improved based on the prisoner's cooperation. Water was similarly controlled, provided in quantity sufficient to prevent death from dehydration, but insufficient for comfort or cleanliness. Prisoners were often forced to choose between drinking and washing, creating conditions of poor hygiene that contributed to illness and further demoralization. The inability to maintain basic cleanliness was particularly devastating for individuals accustomed to higher social standards and served as a constant reminder of their degraded status. Medical care in inquisitorial prisons was minimal and often delayed, provided only when prisoners' conditions threatened to result in death before confession could be obtained. This calculated neglect meant that minor illnesses often became serious health crises, while serious conditions could become life-threatening. The constant threat of illness, combined with the knowledge that medical care depended entirely on their captors' discretion, created additional psychological pressure on prisoners to cooperate with their interrogators. The interrogation, techniques of psychological pressure. The interrogation process represented the heart of the inquisitorial system, where centuries of accumulated knowledge about human psychology were applied with scientific precision to break down resistance and extract confessions. These sessions were not simply attempts to gather information, but carefully orchestrated psychological campaigns designed to convince prisoners that confession was their only hope for survival and redemption. The physical setting of interrogations was designed to maximize psychological impact. The interrogation chamber was typically located deep within the prison complex, reached through a maze of corridors that disoriented prisoners and reinforced their isolation from the outside world. The chamber itself was often larger than the prisoner's cell, with high ceilings and minimal furnishing that made the accused feel small and vulnerable. A raised platform for the inquisitors emphasized the power differential, while the presence of scribes, guards, and other officials created an atmosphere of formal, inescapable judgment. The timing of interrogations was carefully manipulated to maximize psychological pressure. Sessions might be scheduled at irregular intervals, preventing prisoners from developing any sense of routine or predictability. Long periods without interrogation, sometimes lasting weeks or months, were followed by intensive sessions that might continue for hours. This unpredictability kept prisoners in a constant state of anxiety and anticipation, making them more likely to view interrogation sessions as opportunities for human contact rather than threats to their safety. The interrogators themselves were selected and trained for their psychological skills rather than their theological knowledge. While they needed sufficient understanding of church doctrine to identify heretical statements, their primary qualification was their ability to manipulate human emotions and exploit psychological vulnerabilities. Many successful inquisitors had backgrounds in law, philosophy, or medicine, fields that provided insight into human nature and behavior. The interrogation process typically began with seemingly benign questions about the prisoner's background, family, and daily life. This approach served multiple purposes. It gathered intelligence that could be used to identify other suspects. It established a pattern of questioning and response that encouraged cooperation, and created a false sense of security that made prisoners more likely to provide information they would later regret sharing. As the interrogation progressed, questions gradually became more pointed and threatening. The inquisitors would present evidence of the prisoner's alleged heretical activities, often mixing accurate information obtained from denunciations with fabricated details designed to test the prisoner's responses. This technique, known as fishing, allowed interrogators to discover the full extent of the prisoner's knowledge and activities, while creating the impression that they already knew everything and that further deception was futile. The use of psychological pressure was refined to an art form. Interrogators would exploit known weaknesses in the prisoner's personality or circumstances, threatening harm to family members, promising mercy in exchange for cooperation, or creating false hope of eventual release. They understood that different personalities required different approaches. Proud individuals might be broken through humiliation, while fearful prisoners might respond better to threats, and religious individuals might be manipulated through appeals to spiritual duty. One of the most effective psychological techniques was the manipulation of time and hope. Prisoners would be told that their cooperation could lead to mercy and eventual freedom, but these promises were always vague and conditional. The interrogation process could extend for months or years, during which prisoners' hopes would be repeatedly raised and dashed. This emotional manipulation was devastatingly effective, as prisoners gradually became willing to say anything that might improve their situation. When confession was the only way out, the ultimate goal of the entire inquisitorial process was the extraction confession, not because confessions necessarily reflected truth, but because they served the institution's need for validation and control. The system was designed to make confession appear to be the prisoner's only hope for survival, even when such confessions were entirely fabricated or extracted through coercion. The pressure to confess began from the moment of arrest and intensified throughout the imprisonment and interrogation process. Prisoners quickly learned that maintaining their innocence only prolonged their suffering, while confession offered a possibility of mercy, reconciliation with the church, and eventual freedom. This created a powerful incentive structure that made false confessions not only likely, but rational from the prisoner's perspective. The content of acceptable confessions was carefully prescribed by inquisitorial procedure. Prisoners had to admit not only to specific heretical acts, but also to the spiritual corruption that had led them astray. They were required to express genuine remorse for their sins, to implicate other heretics who had influenced or accompanied them, and to demonstrate their renewed commitment to Catholic orthodoxy. This comprehensive confession served multiple purposes. It provided the Inquisition with intelligence about heretical networks, it validated the institution's mission and methods, and it created a public record that could be used to justify the prisoner's treatment. The process of obtaining confessions was gradual and cumulative. Initial admissions to minor infractions or associations were used as leverage to extract confessions to more serious crimes. Once a prisoner had admitted to any heretical behavior, the credibility of the denials regarding other charges was severely undermined. This incremental approach made it extremely difficult for prisoners to maintain consistent denials and created a slippery slope toward comprehensive confession. The psychological state of prisoners after months or years of imprisonment, isolation, and interrogation made them particularly susceptible to suggestion and manipulation. Many prisoners eventually lost the ability to distinguish between memories of actual events and scenarios repeatedly suggested by their interrogators. In this confused mental state, false confessions could feel genuinely true to the prisoners themselves, making their testimony appear more convincing to observers. Even after confession, prisoners remained vulnerable to renewed interrogation and additional charges. The Inquisition operated on the principle that heretical corruption was deeply rooted and likely to manifest in multiple ways over time. A confession to one heretical act could serve as evidence of predisposition toward other heresies, leading to new investigations and additional pressure for further confessions. The inquisitorial process thus created a closed system where confession was simultaneously the prisoner's only hope for mercy and the guarantee of their continued vulnerability to persecution. This cruel paradox represented the essential genius and evil of the inquisitorial system. It transformed the basic human need for hope into an instrument of oppression, ensuring that even those who cooperated completely could never be entirely safe from its reach. Part 5. Torture as an instrument. The application of physical torture within the inquisitorial system represented one of history's most systematic attempts to codify and legitimize the infliction of pain as a tool of justice. What made inquisitorial torture particularly insidious was not merely its brutality, but the elaborate legal and theological framework constructed to justify it. The Church, which preached mercy and compassion, developed detailed regulations governing the application of agony. creating a bureaucracy of suffering that transformed torture from an impulsive act of cruelty into a calculated instrument of institutional control. Officially approved methods. The Inquisition's approach to torture was characterized by a paradoxical combination of savage brutality and legalistic precision. Unlike the random violence that marked many medieval conflicts, inquisitorial torture was regulated by detailed procedural manuals that specified when, how, and under what circumstances physical coercion could be applied. These regulations, codified in documents like the Directorium Inquisitorum and various papal bulls, created the illusion that torture was a measured, reluctant resort rather than an integral component of the system. The legal justification for torture rested on several theological and philosophical foundations. Primary among these was a doctrine that the salvation of souls justified extraordinary measures, including the infliction of temporary physical suffering to prevent eternal damnation. Inquisitors argued that the pain inflicted through torture was insignificant compared to the torment of hell that awaited unrepentant heretics, making torture not merely permissible but morally necessary. This reasoning transformed torturers from criminals into spiritual physicians, treating the disease of heresy through painful but necessary medicine. Canon law established specific criteria that supposedly governed the application of torture. Torture could only be applied when there was sufficient evidence to create strong suspicion of heresy, but insufficient proof for conviction. The accused had to be given multiple opportunities to confess voluntarily before physical coercion was employed. Medical examination was required to ensure that the prisoner was physically capable of surviving the ordeal. Most importantly, torture was officially limited to methods that would not cause permanent injury, mutilation, or death, restrictions that proved meaningless in practice. The authorization process for torture involved multiple levels of approval, creating a bureaucratic buffer that allowed individual inquisitors to claim they were merely following institutional directives rather than making personal decisions to inflict pain. A formal consultation between the inquisitor, legal advisors, and medical experts was required before torture could be authorized. This consultation process was carefully documented, creating detailed records that served both to legitimize the procedure and to protect inquisitorial officials from later accusations of excessive cruelty. The theological justification for torture drew heavily on medieval interpretations of Augustine's concept of just war, extended to encompass spiritual warfare against heresy. Inquisitors argued that just as physical violence was acceptable in defense of Christian territories, so spiritual violence was justified in defense of Christian souls. This reasoning allowed the Church to maintain its official commitment to mercy, while simultaneously authorizing the systematic infliction of agony on those who challenged its authority. The official procedures also included elaborate provisions for confession under torture. Statements extracted through physical coercion were technically invalid under canon law, requiring prisoners to ratify their confessions voluntarily after torture ended. However, this requirement was easily circumvented to the threat of renewed torture if confessions were withdrawn. Prisoners who recanted their torture-induced confessions could be subjected to additional sessions, creating a system where voluntary ratification became virtually inevitable. The potro, the garrucha, and other instruments. The specific instruments of torture employed by the Inquisition were chosen and refined through centuries of experimentation, each designed to inflict maximum psychological and physical distress, while technically avoiding the canonical prohibition against permanent mutilation. These devices represented sophisticated engineering applied to the problem of human suffering, demonstrating both medieval technological ingenuity and moral depravity. The potro rack was perhaps the most iconic instrument of inquisitorial torture, a wooden framework that epitomized the intersection of mechanical precision and human cruelty. The device consisted of a rectangular wooden frame equipped with rollers at each end, connected by ropes to the prisoner's wrists and ankles. The victim was secured to the frame and gradually stretched as the rollers were slowly turned, creating excruciating pressure on joints and muscles, while threatening to tear limbs from their sockets. The psychological impact of the potro was as important as its physical effects. The device was often prominently displayed in interrogation chambers, serving as a constant visual reminder of the consequences of continued resistance. The deliberate mechanical nature of the stretching process created a unique form of anticipatory terror, as prisoners could see and feel their bodies being gradually destroyed. The creaking of the wooden frame and the grinding of the rollers created an auditory accompaniment to the torture that became deeply embedded in survivors' memories. Medical knowledge was applied to maximize the potro's effectiveness while avoiding immediate death. Torturers learned to recognize the signs of impending joint dislocation or ligament rupture, stopping just short of permanent damage while maintaining excruciating pressure. This technical expertise transformed torture from a crude infliction of pain into a refined art of controlled destruction, demonstrating how professional knowledge could be perverted to serve institutional cruelty. The Garrucha Strappado represented a different approach to the systematic infliction of suffering, focusing on the shoulders and arms rather than the entire body. This device involved suspending the prisoner by their wrists, which were bound behind their back, then dropping them suddenly to jerk the shoulders violently. Weights were often attached to the prisoner's feet to increase the force of the drop and intensify the resulting pain. The Garrucha was particularly effective because it exploited the natural structure of human anatomy to create maximum distress with minimal visible damage. The sudden wrenching of the shoulder joints caused excruciating pain that could persist for weeks, but rarely left permanent marks that might serve as evidence of torture. This invisibility was crucial for maintaining the legal fiction that torture was carefully controlled and humane. The psychological dynamics of the Garrucha were particularly cruel because they combined periods of suspension, during which prisoners experienced gradually increasing pain as their body weight stretched their joints, with moments of sudden, shocking agony as they were dropped. This alternation between different types of suffering prevented psychological adaptation and maintained constant terror throughout the ordeal. Water torture, known by various names including the taka, represented perhaps the most psychologically devastating of the approved methods. This technique involved forcing large quantities of water down the prisoner's throat while they were restrained and tilted backward, creating the sensation of drowning, while technically avoiding the prohibition against causing death. The procedure was often combined with the insertion of cloth into the throat, which swelled with the water to create additional choking sensations. The effectiveness of water torture lay in its exploitation of fundamental survival instincts. The sensation of drowning triggered primal panic responses that overwhelmed rational thought and resistance. Unlike other forms of torture that caused pain, water torture created the immediate fear of death, making prisoners willing to confess to anything that might stop the procedure. The technique was particularly devastating because it left no visible marks, allowing torturers to claim that no physical violence had been employed. Fire torture, while less commonly employed, was used in cases where other methods had failed to produce confessions. This involved the application of heated metal instruments to the soles of the feet or other sensitive body parts, or the positioning of prisoners near fires to create extreme heat without direct burning. The threat of fire was often more effective than its actual application, as the sight and smell of heating metal created anticipatory terror that could break resistance before physical contact occurred. Legal limits versus cruel reality. The elaborate legal framework surrounding inquisitorial torture created a facade of restraint and regulation that bore little resemblance to the brutal reality experienced by prisoners. The gap between official procedure and actual practice was not accidental oversight, but deliberate policy, allowing the institution to maintain its moral legitimacy while systematically violating its own stated principles. The canonical requirement that torture not cause permanent injury or death was routinely ignored through sophisticated casuistry and procedural manipulation. Inquisitors developed elaborate justifications for exceeding official limits, arguing that persistent heresy justified extraordinary measures. The definition of permanent injury was manipulated to exclude psychological trauma, chronic pain, and disabilities that might not be immediately visible. Deaths during torture were attributed to divine judgment rather than human cruelty, allowing the institution to escape responsibility for its victims' fate. The requirement for medical supervision was similarly perverted. Rather than protecting prisoners from excessive harm, medical experts became collaborators in torture, advising torturers on how to maximize pain while minimizing visible damage. Physicians learned to recognize the signs of impending death or permanent injury, not to prevent such outcomes, but to ensure they occurred only when strategically advantageous. This corruption of medical ethics demonstrated how professional knowledge could be weaponized in service of institutional power. The prohibition against repeated torture was circumvented through the legal fiction of continuation rather than repetition. Inquisitors argued that multiple torture sessions constituted a single, extended application rather than separate incidents, allowing them to subject prisoners to prolonged suffering while technically complying with canonical restrictions. The semantic manipulation demonstrated the institution's willingness to sacrifice truth for the maintenance of legal appearances. Documentation requirements, ostensibly designed to ensure accountability, became tools for legitimization rather than restraint. Detailed records of torture sessions served to justify the procedures employed and protect inquisitorial officials from later criticism. These documents, written in careful legal language, transformed brutal reality into bureaucratic routine, making systematic cruelty appear to be orderly administrative procedure. The involvement of secular authorities in torture procedures created additional layers of plausible deniability. The Church could claim that physical violence was administered by civil officials rather than clerical personnel, while secular authorities argued they were merely executing ecclesiastical directives. This division of responsibility allowed all parties to escape full accountability for the suffering they collectively inflicted. How some resisted and others yielded. The human response to systematic torture revealed both the remarkable resilience of the human spirit and the devastating effectiveness of organized cruelty. Individual reactions to physical coercion varied enormously, depending on factors including physical constitution, psychological makeup, social background, and the strength of religious or ideological convictions. Understanding these variations provides insight into both the mechanics of resistance and the ultimate triumph of institutional brutality over individual courage. Physical resistance to torture was largely futile, as the instruments and procedures were specifically designed to overwhelm human capacity for endurance. However, some prisoners developed strategies for minimizing their suffering and maintaining psychological integrity despite physical coercion. These resistance techniques included controlled breathing methods to manage pain, mental focus exercises to maintain consciousness during extreme duress, and the cultivation of dissociative states that separated mental awareness from physical sensation. Religious faith provided crucial psychological resources for some prisoners, allowing them to interpret their suffering as participation in divine martyrdom rather than simple victimization. Prisoners who maintained strong religious convictions often demonstrated remarkable endurance, viewing their pain as a test of faith rather than punishment for wrongdoing. However, this spiritual resistance was double-edged, as inquisitors learned to exploit religious devotion by framing confession as a form of spiritual humility rather than defeat. The social background of prisoners significantly influenced their response to torture. Individuals from higher social classes, accustomed to comfort and deference, often yielded more quickly to physical coercion than those from laboring backgrounds who had experienced physical hardship throughout their lives. However, educated prisoners sometimes possess greater psychological resources for maintaining mental focus and developing coping strategies during torture. Gender differences in torture response reflected broader social inequalities of the medieval period. Women, who were generally viewed as physically and emotionally weaker, were often subjected to different torture procedures and experienced different expectations regarding their capacity for resistance. However, many women demonstrated extraordinary courage under torture, particularly when their children or families were threatened. The intersection of gender stereotypes and torture procedures created unique forms of suffering for female prisoners. Age was another crucial factor in determining torture response. Younger prisoners often possessed greater physical resilience, but less psychological experience in managing extreme stress. Older prisoners might be more easily broken physically, but possess greater mental resources for maintaining emotional equilibrium. The elderly were sometimes exempted from certain forms of torture, not from mercy, but from recognition that their deaths under torture will provide little institutional benefit. The most successful resistance often came from prisoners who managed to maintain hope and purpose despite their suffering. Those who believed their endurance served a greater cause, whether religious conviction, protection of others, or simple personal integrity, often demonstrated remarkable resilience. However, even the strongest resistance eventually yielded to prolonged, systematic torture, demonstrating the ultimate effectiveness of the inquisitorial system. The psychological aftermath of torture created lasting trauma that extended far beyond the physical ordeal. Survivors often experienced chronic anxiety, recurring nightmares, and profound distrust of authority figures. Many torture survivors never fully recovered psychologically, carrying the scars of their experience throughout their remaining lives. This psychological damage served the Inquisition's broader goals of social control, as torture survivors became living warnings of the consequences of resistance. The yielding to torture, while understandable and ultimately inevitable for most prisoners, created profound psychological conflicts that could persist long after physical healing. Prisoners who confessed under torture often struggled with guilt and shame, feeling they betrayed their principles, their associates, or their faith. This psychological burden served as an additional form of punishment, ensuring that even those who survived torture continue to suffer from their experience. The documentation of torture sessions preserved detailed accounts of both resistance and yielding, creating a comprehensive record of human response to systematic brutality. These records, while serving the immediate needs of inquisitorial bureaucracy, also provided later generations with horrifying evidence of the institution's methods and effects. The survival of these documents ensures that the courage of those who resisted and the suffering of those who yielded will not be forgotten, serving as permanent testimony to both human resilience and institutional evil. Part 6. Survival Strategies. In the face of systematic persecution, those targeted by the Inquisition developed increasingly sophisticated strategies for survival that required extraordinary courage, ingenuity, and adaptability. These survival mechanisms evolved over centuries of persecution, creating complex networks of resistance that operated in the shadows of medieval and early modern society. The development of these strategies reveals not only the resourcefulness of persecuted communities, but also the profound human capacity to adapt and endure even under the most oppressive circumstances. Identity shift and constant migration. The most fundamental survival strategy employed by those fleeing inquisitorial persecution was a complete reconstruction of personal identity, a process that required the abandonment of virtually everything that had previously defined their existence. Identity transformation was not merely a matter of changing names or locations. It involved a comprehensive reinvention of one's entire social, religious, and cultural persona, often requiring the abandonment of family ties, professional networks, and cultural practices that had provided meaning and structure throughout their lives. The process of identity reconstruction typically began with a careful selection of new names that would not immediately identify the bearer as coming from suspect communities. Conversos fleeing Spain might adopt typically Christian names with appropriate regional variations, while also learning to speak local dialects convincingly enough to pass as natives. This linguistic camouflage was crucial, as distinctive accents or speech patterns could immediately identify someone as an outsider and potential target for investigation. Physical appearance modification was another crucial component of identity transformation. Men might alter their grooming habits, adopting local customs regarding facial hair, clothing styles, and personal hygiene practices. Women faced particular challenges in this regard, as female dress codes were often more strictly regulated and regionally distinctive. The adoption of local clothing styles, hairstyles, and jewelry patterns required careful observation and gradual implementation to avoid attracting attention through sudden changes in appearance. Professional identity reconstruction often required the abandonment of traditional occupations that might identify someone as coming from particular ethnic or religious communities. Jewish merchants fleeing persecution might need to learn entirely new trades, while Muslim craftsmen might be forced to abandon specializations that could reveal their origins. This occupational transformation often resulted in significant economic hardship, as individuals were forced to start over in unfamiliar fields without the benefit of established reputations or professional networks. The creation of false personal histories required extraordinary attention to detail and consistency. New identities needed complete backstories that could withstand casual inquiry and investigation, including fabricated family histories, educational backgrounds, and previous residences. These fictional biographies had to be internally consistent and verifiable through documentation when possible, requiring the forgery or acquisition of authentic seeming papers, including baptismal certificates, marriage records, and professional credentials. Migration patterns among those fleeing persecution were carefully planned to maximize safety while maintaining access to essential resources. The most successful refugees understood that random flight was often less effective than strategic relocation to areas where their particular skills would be valued and where existing communities might provide covert support. Italian cities with strong commercial traditions often welcomed skilled merchants regardless of their backgrounds, while university towns might offer opportunities for learned individuals to establish new academic careers. The timing of migration was crucial to its success. Sudden departure often attracted unwanted attention and investigation, while overly gradual transitions might be discovered before completion. The most successful identity transformations were often planned months or years in advance, with individuals gradually establishing connections in their intended destinations while slowly reducing their ties to their original communities. Family separation was one of the most tragic aspects of identity transformation and migration. Entire families rarely moved together, as large groups attracted attention and increased the risk of discovery. Instead, family members might migrate separately over extended periods, sometimes never reuniting. Children were sometimes placed with sympathetic families in their new locations, growing up with entirely different identities from those of their parents. These separations created profound psychological trauma that persisted throughout the lives of those involved. The maintenance of new identities required constant vigilance and performance. Individuals living under false identities had to consistently portray their adopted personas in all social interactions, never allowing momentary lapses that might reveal their true backgrounds. This constant performance created enormous psychological stress, as authentic self-expression became impossible and every social interaction carried the risk of exposure and death. Clandestine support networks. The survival of persecuted communities depended heavily on the development of sophisticated underground networks that provided mutual aid, communication, and protection. These networks operated across religious, ethnic, and national boundaries, creating informal alliances between groups that might otherwise have had little contact. The complexity and effectiveness of these clandestine organizations demonstrated remarkable organizational ability under conditions of extreme danger and uncertainty. Communication systems within these networks were necessarily complex and secretive, relying on codes, symbols, and trusted intermediaries to transmit information while avoiding detection. Merchants traveling between cities often served as messengers, carrying coded letters and verbal messages between communities. These commercial travelers provided ideal cover for clandestine communication, as their frequent movement between locations was expected and rarely questioned. The development of safe houses and refuge networks required careful coordination between sympathetic individuals across wide geographical areas. These refuges range from simple hiding places for individuals fleeing immediate danger to sophisticated way stations that could provide long-term shelter and assistance with identity transformation. The most effective refuge networks included medical care, financial assistance, and connections to employment opportunities in new locations. Financial support systems within clandestine networks were particularly crucial, as persecution often resulted in the confiscation of property and the destruction of economic opportunities. Informal banking systems developed among persecuted communities, allowing individuals to deposit funds in one location and retrieve them in another through trusted intermediaries. These financial networks often operated across national boundaries, enabling refugees to access resources even after fleeing their countries of origin. The recruitment of sympathetic outsiders was essential to the effectiveness of clandestine networks. Non-persecuted individuals who provided assistance did so at considerable personal risk, requiring careful vetting and gradual integration into support systems. These allies might include clergy members who disagreed with inquisitorial methods, merchants who valued skilled workers regardless of their backgrounds, or simply individuals motivated by humanitarian concerns. Information gathering and early warning systems were crucial components of survival networks. Sympathetic individuals within inquisitorial institutions, government offices, and religious hierarchies sometimes provided advance warning of planned arrests or investigations. This intelligence allowed potential targets to flee before being apprehended, though the acquisition and transmission of such information required extraordinary discretion and courage. Legal assistance networks developed among communities with resources and connections, providing access to lawyers, advocates, and legal procedures that might offer protection or delay persecution. While the inquisitorial system was designed to prevent effective legal defense, skilled advocates sometimes found procedural loopholes or jurisdictional conflicts that could provide temporary protection for their clients. The coordination of resistance activities required sophisticated organizational structures that could operate without centralized leadership or formal hierarchies. Successful networks often developed cell-like structures where individual members knew only a few others, limiting the damage that could result from the capture and interrogation of any single participant. This compartmentalization was essential for long-term survival, but made coordination and communication more difficult. Medical networks were particularly important for communities whose religious practices prohibited them from seeking care from mainstream medical practitioners. Jewish communities, for example, maintained networks of physicians and healers who could provide care while respecting dietary laws and other religious requirements. These medical networks also provided crucial assistance to individuals who had been tortured or otherwise harmed by inquisitorial persecution. Secret religious practices. The maintenance of authentic religious identity under conditions of persecution required the development of elaborate systems for conducting worship, education, and ritual observance in complete secrecy. These clandestine religious practices often bore little resemblance to their public counterparts, adapted as they were to the requirements of concealment and the constant threat of discovery. The physical spaces used for secret worship were carefully selected and modified to avoid detection. Private homes were often equipped with hidden chambers or rooms that could be quickly concealed if unexpected visitors arrived. These spaces might be reached through secret passages, hidden behind false walls or concealed beneath floors. The acoustic properties of these hidden spaces were carefully considered, as religious services often involved singing, chanting, or other activities that might be overheard by neighbors or passers-by. Religious texts and artifacts required special handling and concealment techniques. Sacred books might be hidden in false-bottomed chests, concealed within the bindings of innocuous volumes, or even memorized completely to avoid the risk of discovery through physical evidence. Religious artifacts were often disguised as secular objects or incorporated into household items that would not attract suspicion. Jewish families might hide Sabbath candlesticks among everyday kitchen implements, while Muslims might conceal prayer rugs within ordinary bedding. The timing of religious observances had to be carefully coordinated to avoid patterns that might be detected by surveillance. Traditional worship schedules were often abandoned in favor of irregular meetings that would be less likely to attract attention. Some communities developed systems of rotating locations and times, ensuring that regular gatherings never occurred in the same place at predictable intervals. Education in religious traditions required particularly sophisticated concealment strategies, as the transmission of religious knowledge to children was essential for community survival, but extremely dangerous if discovered. Religious instruction was often disguised as secular education, with traditional texts studied under the pretext of learning languages, history, or philosophy. Children were taught to recognize the difference between public and private religious expression from an early age, understanding that their survival depended on maintaining perfect discretion about their family's true beliefs. Ritual adaptation was necessary to accommodate the constraints of secrecy. Traditional ceremonies that required specific foods, objects, or procedures might be modified or simplified to reduce the risk of detection. Jewish families might observe Passover with abbreviated ceremonies and substitute foods that would not attract attention from neighbors. Muslim communities might adapt their prayer practices to eliminate activities that could be observed from outside their meeting places. The maintenance of religious calendars and observances required careful coordination within secret communities. Traditional holidays and holy days continued to be observed, but their celebration had to be completely hidden from outside observation. This often meant that religious festivals were celebrated in isolation from the broader community's celebrations that had previously provided social context and meaning. Marriage and other life cycle ceremonies presented particular challenges for secret religious communities. These important events could not be publicly celebrated according to traditional customs, yet they remained crucial for community cohesion and identity maintenance. Secret religious authorities often developed abbreviated or modified ceremonies that preserved essential spiritual elements while minimizing the risk of detection. The training and ordination of religious leaders within clandestine communities required extensive networks of education and authorization that operated completely outside official religious institutions. These informal seminaries and schools provided essential continuity for religious traditions while adapting their curricula and methods to the requirements of secrecy, bribery, and political influence as protection. The corruption inherent in medieval political and religious institutions created opportunities for those with sufficient resources to purchase protection from persecution. While bribery and political manipulation were risky strategies that could backfire catastrophically if discovered, they also represented some of the most effective methods for avoiding or escaping inquisitorial attention. The identification of corruptible officials required careful intelligence gathering and assessment of individual motivations and vulnerabilities. Successful bribery often depended less on the amount of money offered than on understanding what particular officials valued most highly. Some might be motivated by direct financial gain, while others might be more interested in political advancement, social recognition, or personal favors that could benefit their families or associates. Financial corruption took many forms beyond simple monetary payments. Business partnerships, investment opportunities, and commercial privileges could all serve as forms of bribery that provided ongoing benefits to corrupt officials while maintaining plausible deniability about the true nature of the relationship. Wealthy merchants might offer exclusive trading agreements or favorable terms on luxury goods, while skilled professionals might provide services at reduced rates or without charge. Political influence was often more effective than direct bribery, though it required more sophisticated networks and longer-term relationship building. Individuals with connections to powerful noble families, high-ranking clergy, or royal courts could sometimes obtain protection through political intervention. These relationships might be cultivated over years or decades, with favors and services provided long before protection was needed. The timing of bribery attempts was crucial to their success. Approaches made too early might be viewed with suspicion or result in denunciation, while those made too late might be ineffective if official attention had already been focused on particular individuals or communities. The most successful practitioners of the strategy maintained ongoing relationships with potentially useful officials, providing regular benefits that created obligations and loyalties that could be called upon when needed. The risks associated with bribery and political manipulation were enormous, as discovery could result in charges of corruption in addition to the original allegations of heresy. Officials who accepted bribes were themselves vulnerable to denunciation and persecution, creating mutual vulnerability that could either strengthen protective relationship or lead to betrayal if circumstances changed. Legal manipulation through bribery often focused on procedural delays and jurisdictional conflicts rather than direct intervention in trial outcomes. Corrupt officials might ensure that cases move slowly through the legal system, providing time for other escape strategies to be implemented. They might also create conflicts between different courts or authorities, resulting in lengthy jurisdictional disputes that could prevent or delay prosecution. The protection of entire communities through political influence required coordination between multiple officials and institutions. Successful community protection often involved the cultivation of relationships with secular authorities who could challenge inquisitorial jurisdiction, creating political conflicts that provided space for negotiation and compromise. The sustainability of protection through corruption was always uncertain, as political circumstances, personnel changes, and shifting priorities could quickly eliminate previously reliable safeguards. Individuals and communities that relied too heavily on corrupt protection often found themselves vulnerable when their patrons lost power or when new officials proved less amenable to accommodation. The moral complexities of survival through corruption created additional psychological burdens for those who employed these strategies. Many individuals struggle with the ethical implications of bribing officials and manipulating political systems, particularly when their actions might indirectly contribute to persecution of others who lack similar resources or connections. These moral dilemmas added another layer of trauma to the experience of persecution, forcing individuals to compromise their principles in service of their survival. Part 7. Life in Inquisitorial Prisons. The daily existence within inquisitorial prisons represented a carefully orchestrated nightmare designed to break human spirit through the systematic elimination of dignity, hope, and basic human contact. Unlike secular prisons of the period, which were often chaotic and violent but retained some connection to the outside world, inquisitorial facilities were engineered to create a state of total isolation and psychological disintegration. Understanding life within these institutions reveals a profound cruelty that underpinned the entire system and the remarkable resilience of those who managed to survive within their walls. Prisoners' daily routine. The structure of daily life in inquisitorial prisons was deliberately designed to destroy any sense of normalcy or personal agency that might provide psychological comfort to inmates. Every aspect of the daily routine, from waking to sleeping, was controlled by prison authorities and subjected to arbitrary changes that prevented prisoners from developing adaptive strategies or finding predictable rhythms that might offer mental stability. The day typically began before dawn with the ringing of bells from nearby churches or monasteries, a sound that served as a cruel reminder of the religious community from which prisoners had been excluded. Unlike the faithful who rose to pray, prisoners were awakened to face another day of uncertainty, hunger, and fear. The early morning hours were often the most psychologically devastating, as the transition from sleep, the only escape from their circumstances, to waking consciousness forced prisoners to confront their situation anew each day. Morning prayers were mandatory for all prisoners, regardless of their personal beliefs or the charges against them. These sessions were conducted under the supervision of prison chaplains and were designed not to provide spiritual comfort, but to demonstrate the prisoners' continued subjugation to church authority. Prisoners were required to recite Catholic prayers, participate in religious responses, and demonstrate appropriate devotion, with any signs of reluctance or insincerity noted for later use in their trials. The distribution of breakfast, such as it was, followed a pattern designed to emphasize the prisoners' complete dependence on their captors' goodwill. Food was delivered through small openings in cell doors, preventing face-to-face contact with guards and reinforcing the sense of isolation. The quality and quantity of food varied unpredictably, with some prisoners receiving slightly more or better meals based on factors they could never fully understand: their cooperation with interrogations, their perceived importance to ongoing investigations, or simply the arbitrary decisions of prison officials. Work assignments, when they existed, were designed to be both physically exhausting and psychologically demoralizing. Prisoners might be required to perform menial tasks such as cleaning prison facilities, copying religious texts, or engaging in repetitive manual labor that served no productive purpose beyond keeping them occupied and demonstrating their submission. The work was typically solitary, preventing prisoners from developing relationships or sharing information that might provide mutual support. Meal times were carefully structured to maximize psychological impact while maintaining minimal nutritional standards necessary to keep prisoners alive for interrogation and trial. The main meal of the day was typically served in mid-afternoon, consisting of thin gruel, stale bread, and occasionally small portions of vegetables or meat of questionable quality. The timing of meals was deliberately irregular, preventing prisoners from developing any sense of routine or predictability that might provide psychological anchoring. Evening hours were often the most difficult for prisoners, as the approaching darkness brought both the terror of nightmares and the dread of potential midnight interrogations. Prisoners were typically confined to their cells before sunset, left alone with their thoughts and fears for the long hours until dawn. The absence of artificial lighting meant that evenings were spent in nearly complete darkness, creating an environment conducive to despair and mental breakdown. Sleep, when it came, was frequently interrupted by deliberate disturbances designed to prevent prisoners from achieving the rest necessary for psychological resilience. Guards might conduct cell inspections at irregular intervals throughout the night, create loud noises in prison corridors, or wake prisoners for brief interrogations that served no purpose beyond sleep deprivation. This systematic disruption of sleep patterns was recognized as an effective method of weakening psychological resistance and preparing prisoners for more intensive interrogation sessions. The regulation of personal hygiene was another tool of psychological control. Prisoners were rarely provided with adequate water for washing, clean clothing, or basic sanitary facilities. This forced neglect of personal cleanliness served multiple purposes. It weakened prisoners' health and resistance to disease. It stripped away their sense of personal dignity and social identity, and it created physical discomfort that added to their overall misery. Religious observances were mandatory and frequent, but they were structured to emphasize the prisoner's fallen status rather than provide spiritual comfort. Daily attendance at Mass, participation in prayers, and listening to sermons were required, but prisoners were segregated from free Catholics and forced to occupy positions that marked them as penitent sinners. These religious exercises served as constant reminders of their excommunicated status and their need for institutional forgiveness. Hierarchy among inmates, Despite the Inquisition's theoretical commitment to the equality of all souls before God, inquisitorial prisons developed complex social hierarchies that reflected both the outside world's class structures and the specific dynamics of the institution itself. These hierarchies served the administration's interests by creating divisions among prisoners that prevented unified resistance, while providing some inmates with incentives to cooperate with prison authorities. The most fundamental division was between those who confessed to their alleged crimes and those who maintained their innocence. Confessed heretics, particularly those who demonstrated genuine repentance and provided useful information about other suspects, often received better treatment, improved living conditions, and greater freedom of movement within the prison. This preferential treatment served as a powerful incentive for confession, while creating resentment among prisoners who maintained their innocence. Social class distinctions from the outside world were partially maintained within prison walls, though they were significantly modified by the specific circumstances of incarceration. Wealthy prisoners or those from noble families might receive better food, more comfortable cells, or permission to have books and writing materials. However, this preferential treatment was contingent on their cooperation with authorities and could be withdrawn at any time as punishment for perceived defiance. Educational background created another layer of hierarchy within prison populations. Literate prisoners, particularly those with theological training, were sometimes employed as scribes or assistants to prison officials, positions that provided both better treatment and access to information about prison operations. These educated prisoners often served as informal leaders among their fellow inmates, providing guidance and support to those less equipped to navigate the complex prison environment. The length of imprisonment created its own status hierarchy, with long-term prisoners developing knowledge and survival skills that were valuable to newer arrivals. These prison veterans understood the unwritten rules of institutional life, knew which guards might be approachable for small favors, and had developed strategies for maintaining psychological stability under extreme conditions. Their knowledge made them influential figures among the prison population, though their influence had to be exercised carefully to avoid attracting unwanted attention from authorities. Religious background played a complex role in prison hierarchies. Converted Jews, conversos, and converted Muslims, Moriscos, were often viewed with suspicion by other prisoners who saw them as more likely to be genuine heretics. This created additional isolation for members of these groups, who found themselves excluded not only from normal society, but also from the limited community that developed among fellow prisoners. The severity of charges created another dimension of prison hierarchy. Those accused of minor infractions or first-time offenses might be treated with some consideration, while those charged with serious heresy or repeat offenses face harsher conditions and greater suspicion from both guards and fellow prisoners. This differentiation was often arbitrary, as the specific charges against individual prisoners were rarely common knowledge within the prison. Gender created perhaps the most significant divide within mixed prison populations. Female prisoners were typically housed separately and subjected to different treatment protocols, but when interaction occurred, traditional gender roles were often exaggerated in the prison environment. Women were expected to demonstrate even greater submissiveness and repentance than male prisoners, while also facing additional forms of sexual vulnerability and exploitation. The willingness to inform on fellow prisoners created a particularly toxic element in prison hierarchies. Those suspected of reporting conversations or activities to prison authorities were shunned by other inmates, creating a climate of suspicion and paranoia that served the institution's goal of preventing prisoner solidarity. However, known informants sometimes received protection and privileges from guards, creating complex loyalties and resentments within the prison community. Secret communication and codes. Despite the Inquisition's elaborate efforts to prevent communication among prisoners, inmate populations developed sophisticated systems for sharing information, providing mutual support, and maintaining connections to the outside world. These communication networks demonstrated remarkable ingenuity and represented one of the few forms of resistance available to prisoners under constant surveillance. Physical communication methods exploited every possible weakness in prison architecture and supervision. Prisoners learned to communicate through thin walls by developing tapping codes that could convey letters, words, and eventually complex messages. These acoustic systems often use variations on traditional Morse-like codes, with different combinations of taps representing letters of the alphabet. The development and teaching of these codes required careful coordination and considerable risk, as discovery could result in severe punishment. Written communication was extremely dangerous, but occasionally possible through the use of improvised materials and concealment techniques. Prisoners might use charcoal, blood, or other available substances to write messages on cloth, wood, or paper scraps. These messages were then concealed in food containers, hidden in cell walls, or passed through sympathetic guards or fellow prisoners. The content of such messages was typically coded or written in cryptic language that would be meaningless to casual observers. The use of intermediaries was essential for more complex communication networks. Prisoners who worked in prison kitchens, cleaning facilities, or administrative areas sometimes had opportunities to carry messages between isolated inmates. These intermediaries took enormous risks, as discovery would result in immediate punishment and possible transfer to worse conditions. The selection of reliable messengers required careful assessment of character and motivation, as prison authorities often attempted to recruit prisoners as informants. Religious services provided one of the few opportunities for prisoners to gather in groups, creating possibilities for communication through subtle gestures, shared hymns with coded meanings, or brief whisper exchanges during prayers. Prisoners developed systems of eye contact, facial expressions, and body language that could convey basic information about their conditions, upcoming interrogations, or news from the outside world. These nonverbal communication methods required considerable practice and discretion to avoid detection. The development of coded languages allowed prisoners to communicate even when their conversations were overheard by guards. These codes might involve the use of religious terminology with hidden meanings, references to biblical stories that conveyed current information, or seemingly innocent discussions of family members that actually describe prison conditions or planned activities. The complexity of these codes varied depending on the educational background of prisoners involved and the time available for their development. Books and written materials, when available, provided another medium for secret communication. Prisoners might use existing texts as the basis for coded messages, marking specific letters or words that would spell out hidden meanings when read in sequence. Religious texts were particularly useful for this purpose, as their presence was less likely to arouse suspicion, and their familiar content provided a ready framework for coded communication. The maintenance of calendars and temporal awareness required coordination among prisoners, as the deliberate disorientation created by prison conditions made it easy to lose track of time, dates, and seasons. Some prisoners took responsibility for maintaining accurate records of time passage, sharing this information with others through coded communications. This temporal awareness was crucial for maintaining psychological stability and coordinating activities with outside supporters. Information about the outside world was among the most valuable commodities in prison communication networks. News about family members, political developments, or changes in inquisitorial policy was eagerly sought and carefully shared among prisoners. This information provided hope, helped prisoners make informed decisions about their legal strategies, and maintain their connection to the world beyond prison walls. Disease, starvation, and death in prisons. The physical conditions in inquisitorial prisons were deliberately designed to weaken prisoners' health and resistance, while technically avoiding the canonical prohibition against causing death through direct violence. This systematic neglect created environments where disease flourished, malnutrition was chronic, and death was a constant presence that served as both threat and release for the incarcerated population. Overcrowding was a persistent problem in most inquisitorial facilities, as the system's efficiency in arresting suspects often exceeded its capacity to house them adequately. Cells designed for single occupancy might hold multiple prisoners, creating conditions that facilitated the spread of disease, while adding psychological stress through forced intimacy with strangers. The lack of privacy and personal space created additional mental strain that contributed to the overall deterioration of prisoners' psychological condition. Sanitation facilities were minimal and often completely inadequate for the number of prisoners housed in the facility. Waste disposal systems, when they existed, were primitive and frequently overwhelmed, creating environments where disease could spread rapidly through contaminated water supplies and accumulated filth. The lack of adequate sanitation served both to weaken prisoners physically and to strip away their sense of human dignity through forced exposure to degrading conditions. Nutrition was carefully calculated to maintain life, while preventing the restoration of physical strength or mental clarity. The diet provided to prisoners typically consisted of bread, thin gruel, and occasional vegetables, with protein sources being rare and of poor quality. This chronic malnutrition had severe effects on prisoners' immune systems, making them more susceptible to infectious diseases, while slowing recovery from injuries sustained during interrogation or torture. Medical care was extremely limited and often deliberately withheld as a form of psychological pressure. Prison physicians, when they existed at all, were typically more concerned with keeping prisoners alive for trial than with providing genuine healing or comfort. Medical treatment was often contingent on cooperation with interrogators, creating a system where prisoners' help became another tool of coercion and control. Infectious diseases spread rapidly through prison populations due to a combination of overcrowding, poor sanitation, malnutrition, and limited medical care. Outbreaks of dysentery, typhus, plague, and other epidemic diseases could devastate entire prison populations within weeks. These epidemics were often viewed by prison authorities as divine judgment rather than preventable consequences of poor conditions, allowing them to avoid responsibility for the massive death tolls that resulted. Mental illness was extremely common among long-term prisoners, manifesting in various forms of psychological breakdown that range from depression and anxiety to complete psychotic episodes. The isolation, uncertainty, and constant fear that characterized prison life created conditions that were almost guaranteed to produce mental instability. Prisoners who displayed signs of mental illness were rarely provided with appropriate care and were often viewed as either malingering or genuinely possessed by evil spirits. The treatment of sick and dying prisoners revealed the fundamental inhumanity of the inquisitorial system. Dying prisoners were often denied last rites or final confessions unless they provided information useful to ongoing investigations. Bodies of deceased prisoners were sometimes dissected for evidence of demonic influence or disposed of in unmarked graves without notification to family members. This treatment of the dead served to terrorize surviving prisoners, while demonstrating the complete dehumanization that characterized the institution's approach to those under its control. Seasonal variations in health conditions created predictable patterns of increased mortality during winter months, when heating was inadequate and food supplies were most limited. Summer months brought different challenges, including heat-related illnesses and increased problems with sanitation and water quality. These seasonal health crises were rarely addressed through improved conditions, but rather accepted as natural consequences of imprisonment. The psychological impact of witnessing constant death and suffering among fellow prisoners created additional trauma for survivors. Prisoners were forced to live in close proximity to serious illness and death, often without any means of providing comfort or assistance to those who were suffering. This forced witnessing of others' pain and degradation served as a constant reminder of their own vulnerability and the ultimate futility of resistance. The documentation of deaths in inquisitorial prisons was often incomplete or deliberately falsified to avoid criticism of prison conditions. Official records might attribute deaths to natural causes or divine judgment rather than acknowledging the role of neglect, malnutrition, or deliberate mistreatment. This manipulation of death records served to protect prison officials from accountability while maintaining the legal fiction that prisoners were being held for a spiritual benefit rather than punishment. Despite these horrific conditions, some prisoners managed to maintain their humanity and provide support to fellow inmates even under the most extreme circumstances. Acts of kindness, sharing of scarce resources, and mutual emotional support created bonds of solidarity that transcended the divisions the institution sought to create. These displays of human compassion and resilience provided some of the few sources of hope and meaning available to prisoners facing almost certain death or permanent psychological damage from their incarceration. Part 8. The Act of Faith. The auto de fe Act of Faith represented the ultimate theatrical expression of inquisitorial power, transforming the machinery of religious persecution into public spectacle that served multiple functions simultaneously: punishment for the condemned, education for the masses, and validation for the institution itself. These elaborate ceremonies were carefully orchestrated events that combined religious ritual, legal procedure, and public entertainment in ways that maximized both their psychological impact and their effectiveness as tools of social control. Public ceremonies of humiliation. The staging of an auto de fe was a masterpiece of psychological theater that began weeks before the actual ceremony. with extensive public preparations designed to build anticipation and fear throughout the community. The announcement of an upcoming auto da fe was made through official proclamations read in churches, marketplaces, and other public gathering spaces, creating an atmosphere of anxious expectation that permeated the entire social fabric of the affected region. The selection of location for these ceremonies was never arbitrary, but reflected careful consideration of maximum psychological impact. The most prestigious autos da fe were held in major city squares, cathedral plazas, or specially constructed amphitheaters that could accommodate large crowds while providing clear sightlines for all spectators. The choice of sacred or politically significant spaces served to legitimize the proceedings, while emphasizing the religious and governmental authority behind the persecution. Physical preparations for the ceremony were deliberately elaborate and visible, serving as a form of psychological preparation for the community. Carpenters erected viewing platforms for dignitaries, constructed stakes for executions, and built stages for the reading of sentences. These construction activities, carried out over several days or weeks, created mounting tension and served as constant reminders of the approaching spectacle. The visibility of these preparations ensured that no member of the community could remain unaware of what was to come. The procession that marked the beginning of each auto da fe was itself a carefully choreographed display of power and hierarchy. Religious officials, secular authorities, and representatives of various social organizations participated in a predetermined order that reflected and reinforced existing power structures. The condemned prisoners were positioned within this procession in ways that emphasized their fallen status, while making them visible to gathered crowds as objects of both pity and condemnation. The costuming of condemned prisoners was designed to maximize their humiliation, while conveying specific information about their crimes and sentences to the watching crowds. The infamous San Benito, a yellow penitential garment, was decorated with symbols that indicated the nature of the wearer's offenses and severity of their punishment. These visual codes allowed spectators to understand immediately each prisoner's status and fate, creating a system of public communication that reinforced the ceremony's educational function. The reading of charges and sentences was conducted with elaborate formality that emphasized the legal and religious authority behind proceedings. Each prisoner's name, crimes, and punishment were announced to the crowd, often with detailed explanations of the evidence that had led to their conviction. This public recitation served multiple purposes. It provided legal validation for proceedings. It educated the crowd about the types of behavior that the Inquisition considered criminal, and it created a permanent public record of each individual's disgrace. Music and religious ceremonies accompanied the proceedings, creating an atmosphere that combined celebration with solemnity in ways designed to confuse and overwhelm spectators' emotional responses. Hymns of thanksgiving for the triumph of Orthodox faith were interspersed with prayers for the souls of the condemned, creating a complex emotional environment that made it difficult for observers to maintain clear moral judgments about what they were witnessing. The physical positioning of spectators was carefully managed to maximize the psychological impact of the ceremony while maintaining social order. Distinguished visitors and high-ranking officials occupied elevated positions that allowed them clear views while emphasizing their authority over proceedings. Common citizens were arranged in designated areas that ensured their participation while preventing disruption of the ceremony's carefully planned progression. The duration of these ceremonies was deliberately extended, often lasting entire days, to ensure maximum exposure for all participants and observers. This temporal extension served multiple functions. It allowed for the complete performance of all ritual elements. It maximized the educational impact through sustained attention, and it created physical exhaustion among spectators that made them more susceptible to emotional manipulation. Different types of penance. The variety of punishments announced and administered during autos da fe reflected the Inquisition's sophisticated understanding of psychological manipulation and social control. Rather than relying solely on physical punishment or execution, the institution developed a complex taxonomy of penances designed to serve different functions and send specific messages to both the condemned individuals and the observing community. Reconciliation represented the most lenient category of punishment, reserved for those who had confessed their errors voluntarily and demonstrated what authorities deemed genuine repentance. Reconciled penitents were formally readmitted to the church community, but remained subject to various ongoing restrictions and obligations designed to ensure their continued orthodoxy. These individuals wore the San Benito for specified periods, were forbidden from holding certain occupations or positions of authority, and remained under lifelong suspicion that could be reactivated at any time. The wearing of penitential garments served both as punishment and as a form of ongoing public identification that marked former heretics as permanently suspect members of society. The San Benito had to be worn in public for periods ranging from months to years, creating ongoing humiliation and social isolation that extended the punishment far beyond the ceremony itself. These garments were often preserved in churches after the penitent's period of wearing had ended, serving as permanent reminders of their disgrace and warnings to potential future offenders. Property confiscation was a standard component of most sentences, serving both as punishment and as a source of revenue for the Inquisition and its secular partners. The seizure of goods, lands, and financial assets often had devastating effects that extended far beyond condemned individuals to encompass their families and business associates. This economic dimension of punishment created powerful incentives for community members to avoid any association with suspected heretics, while simultaneously funding the continued expansion of inquisitorial activities. Exile and banishment were frequently imposed as alternatives to more severe physical punishments, particularly for individuals whose continued presence in their home communities was deemed disruptive to social order. These sentences often specified not only that the individual must leave their current location, but also designated specific areas where they were forbidden to settle, creating a form of internal displacement that could render survival extremely difficult. Imprisonment sentences varied dramatically in their severity and duration, ranging from brief periods of confinement designed primarily for symbolic purposes to life sentences that amounted to slow death through deliberate neglect. Some prisoners were confined to their homes under house arrest, while others were sent to formal inquisitorial prisons or monasteries where they would remain under constant supervision for the remainder of their lives. Flogging and other forms of corporal punishment were administered publicly as part of the auto de fe ceremony, serving both as direct punishment for the condemned and as vivid demonstrations of inquisitorial power for the watching crowds. These physical punishments were carefully calibrated to cause significant pain and humiliation without causing immediate death, though the long-term health consequences were often severe. Professional and social restrictions were imposed on reconciled penitents and their descendants, creating hereditary consequences that extended the punishment across generations. Former heretics and their children were often forbidden from practicing medicine, law, or other prestigious professions, from holding public office, or from entering religious orders. These restrictions served to create permanent castes of second-class citizens whose degraded status reinforced social hierarchies and demonstrated the long-term consequences of challenging religious authority. Spiritual penances included prescribed prayers, pilgrimages, and religious observances that were designed to demonstrate the penitent's renewed commitment to Orthodox faith, while providing ongoing mechanisms for surveillance and control. These spiritual requirements often involved public displays of devotion that served as continuing reminders of the individual's former errors and current subordinate status. The spectacle of death at the stake. The execution of unrepentant heretics by burning represented the climactic moment of the auto de fe, a carefully orchestrated spectacle of death that served as the ultimate demonstration of institutional power and divine judgment. These executions were not simply methods of capital punishment, but elaborate theatrical performances designed to maximize their psychological impact on both the condemned individuals and the watching crowds. The construction of execution pyres was itself a public spectacle that began days before the actual ceremony. These structures were built to precise specifications that balanced practical considerations, ensuring the fire would burn hot enough to cause death while remaining visible to large crowds, with symbolic elements that reinforce religious messages about divine judgment and eternal punishment. The height, materials, and decoration of pyres varied depending on perceived importance of the execution and the resources available to local authorities. The final preparations of condemned prisoners involved both practical and ritualistic elements designed to maximize the drama of their deaths, while providing final opportunities for conversion that might demonstrate divine mercy. Prisoners were often offered last-minute opportunities to recant their heresies and accept reconciliation with the church, creating moments of high tension as crowds waited to see whether the condemned would choose salvation or persist in their errors unto death. The process of securing prisoners to stakes was conducted with deliberate ceremony that emphasized both the inevitability of their fate and the religious significance of their punishment. The condemned were typically bound with ropes or chains in positions that allowed them to remain visible to the crowd while ensuring they could not escape the flames. Some prisoners were provided with small platforms or supports that delayed their direct contact with fire, extending the duration of their suffering while providing additional opportunities for dramatic last-minute conversions. The ignition of fires was timed and conducted with maximum theatrical impact, often involving multiple torches carried by religious officials or secular authorities who participated in the execution as an expression of their commitment to Orthodox faith. The ceremonial lighting of pyres created moments of intense drama as crowds watched flames take hold and begin their deadly work, marking the point of no return for condemned while demonstrating the ultimate power of institutional authority. The behavior of condemned prisoners during their executions was carefully observed and interpreted as evidence of their spiritual state and the justice of their punishment. Those who maintained their defiance or continued to proclaim heretical beliefs were seen as confirming their evil nature and the necessity of their destruction. Conversely, prisoners who expressed repentance or called upon orthodox religious formulas were sometimes interpreted as achieving last-minute salvation, though this rarely affected their physical fate. The duration of executions varied considerably depending on weather conditions, the construction of pyres, and the physical condition of the condemned. Some prisoners died quickly from smoke inhalation, while others might survive for extended periods, providing opportunities for dramatic interactions with clergy, expressions of repentance or defiance, and prolonged demonstrations of the consequences of heretical beliefs. These variations in execution duration were often interpreted as divine interventions that revealed God's judgment on particular individuals. Medical knowledge was sometimes applied to execution procedures in ways designed to prolong suffering while maintaining the appearance of standard practice. Executioners learned techniques for positioning prisoners and constructing fires that would maximize pain and extend consciousness while ensuring eventual death. This application of technical expertise to the infliction of suffering demonstrated the systematic nature of inquisitorial cruelty and the institutional commitment to making executions as effective as possible as tools of terror and control. Psychological impact on the population. The psychological effect of autos de fe extended far beyond their immediate participants to encompass entire communities and regions, creating lasting trauma that influenced social behavior, religious practice, and cultural development for generations. These ceremonies were designed not merely to punish specific individuals, but to reshape the mental landscape of entire populations through the systematic application of terror and the demonstration of institutional omnipotence. The anticipation phase preceding each auto de fe created community-wide anxiety that served many of the institution's goals even before the ceremony began. The announcement of upcoming proceedings triggered waves of fear, confession, and denunciation as community members sought to protect themselves by demonstrating their orthodoxy and loyalty. This anticipatory period often produced more conversions and revelations than the ceremony itself, demonstrating the effectiveness of psychological pressure in achieving institutional objectives. The mandatory attendance requirements for autos de fe ensured that entire populations were exposed to the psychological impact of these events, creating shared traumatic experiences that bound communities together in fear and complicity. Children, adults, and elderly citizens were all required to witness executions and punishments, creating generational transmission of trauma that influenced cultural attitudes toward authority, dissent, and religious expression for decades after the events themselves. The educational function of these ceremonies was explicitly designed to modify social behavior through the demonstration of consequences for nonconformity. Spectators learned detailed lessons about the types of beliefs and behaviors that authorities considered dangerous, the investigative methods used to detect heresy, and the punishments awaiting those who challenged established orthodoxy. This education created self-censoring populations that modified their own behavior to avoid attracting inquisitorial attention. Social fragmentation was an inevitable consequence of the denunciation requirements that accompanied autos de fe. Communities that had been encouraged to identify and report suspected heretics among their neighbors found their social fabric permanently damaged by mistrust and suspicion. The knowledge that anyone might be an informant created paranoid social environments where authentic relationships became extremely difficult to maintain. Religious observance was fundamentally altered by the psychological impact of autos de fe, as populations learned to demonstrate their faith through exaggerated displays of orthodoxy designed to deflect suspicion rather than express genuine spiritual conviction. Churches became theaters for performance of loyalty rather than spaces for authentic worship, as congregations understood that their behavior was constantly monitored for signs of insufficient devotion or heterodox thinking. Economic behavior was also modified by the psychological impact of these ceremonies, as communities learned that association with condemned heretics could result in property confiscation and social disgrace. Business relationships, investment decisions, and commercial partnerships were all influenced by religious considerations, as economic actors sought to avoid any connections that might attract inquisitorial attention. Cultural expression was severely constrained by the psychological effects of autos de fe, as artists, writers, musicians, and other creative individuals understood that their work would be scrutinized for signs of heterodox thinking or dangerous innovation. This cultural censorship, largely self-imposed through fear rather than formal regulation, resulted in the standardization and impoverishment of intellectual and artistic life in affected regions. The long-term psychological effects of witnessing autos de fe included various forms of trauma that manifested in individual and community pathologies that persisted long after the Inquisition's power had waned. Survivors of these events often experienced recurring nightmares, anxiety disorders, and obsessive religious behaviors that reflected their efforts to cope with the psychological damage caused by witnessing extreme violence sanctioned by religious and governmental authority. The normalization of violence was perhaps the most disturbing long-term consequence of the psychological impact of autos de fe. Populations that had been forced to witness and approve of torture and execution in religious contexts developed altered moral sensibilities that made them more accepting of institutional violence and less capable of recognizing and resisting abuse of authority. This normalization served the interests of authoritarian institutions, but created lasting damage to the moral fabric of affected societies. The transmission of trauma across generations ensured that the psychological impact of autos de fe extended far beyond their historical period. Children who witnessed these events carried their traumatic memories throughout their lives, influencing their own parenting practices, religious beliefs, and social relationships in ways that transmitted fear and conformity to subsequent generations. This intergenerational transmission of trauma created cultural patterns that persisted long after the institution that created them had disappeared, demonstrating the profound and lasting effectiveness of systematic psychological manipulation as a tool of social control. Part 9. Resistance and Escape. Despite the overwhelming power of the Inquisition and the systematic nature of its persecution, countless individuals and communities found ways to resist, escape, and survive beyond the reach of inquisitorial authority. These stories of successful resistance represent some of the most inspiring chapters in the long history of human struggle against institutional oppression, demonstrating that even the most comprehensive systems of control could be challenged and overcome through courage, ingenuity, and mutual solidarity. Successful escape stories. The escape of Antonio Perez, secretary to King Philip II of Spain, represents one of the most dramatic and politically significant examples of successful flight from inquisitorial persecution. Accused of treason and heresy in 1590, Perez managed to flee from prison in Madrid through a carefully coordinated plan that involved corrupted guards, forged documents, and a network of supporters who had prepared safe houses along his escape route. His flight to Aragon and later to France and England demonstrated that even the most powerful figures could successfully evade inquisitorial justice when they possessed sufficient resources and political connections. Perez's escape was particularly significant because it exposed the limitations of inquisitorial power when confronted with organized resistance and international complications. His supporters in Aragon actively resisted attempts to extradite him, leading to armed conflicts that revealed the tensions between regional autonomy and central authority that the Inquisition depended upon for its effectiveness. His eventual asylum in Protestant countries also demonstrated how religious conflicts between Catholic and Protestant powers could provide opportunities for refugees to find safety beyond inquisitorial reach. The mass exodus of conversos from Spain following the establishment of the Spanish Inquisition in 1478 represents a different, but equally significant form of successful resistance. Thousands of Jewish families who had converted to Christianity but faced ongoing suspicion and persecution organized coordinated emigration efforts that moved entire communities to safer territories. These migrations required enormous planning, financial resources, and courage, as discovered immigrants faced immediate execution. One particularly well-documented case involves the Abravanel family, prominent conversos who used their international banking connections to coordinate the escape of hundreds of Jewish families from Spain to Italy, the Ottoman Empire, and other territories where they could practice their religion more openly. Isaac Abravanel, who had served as treasurer to King Ferdinand and Queen Isabella, used his diplomatic connections and financial resources to establish refuge networks that helped preserve entire Jewish communities that would otherwise have been destroyed by inquisitorial persecution. The escape of imprisoned heretics from inquisitorial prisons, while extremely rare, occasionally succeeded through combinations of inside assistance, architectural weaknesses, and careful timing. The most famous such escape occurred in 1559 when 12 Protestants imprisoned in Seville managed to break out of their cells during a carefully coordinated operation that involved sympathetic guards, forged keys, and a network of supporters who provided hiding places and transportation to safety. This Seville escape was particularly significant because it involved prisoners who had already been sentenced to death and were awaiting execution at an upcoming auto da fe. Their successful flight not only saved their lives, but also dealt a significant blow to inquisitorial prestige, demonstrating that the institution's power was not absolute. The escaped prisoners eventually reached Geneva, where they provided detailed accounts of inquisitorial procedures that were published throughout Protestant Europe, contributing to international opposition to the institution. Individual escape stories often involved remarkable displays of ingenuity and determination. Catalina de Erauso, known as a lieutenant nun, successfully escaped from a convent where she had been confined for suspected heretical beliefs by disguising herself as a man and fleeing to the Americas, where she lived for decades under her male identity. Her case demonstrates how gender transformation could provide opportunities for escape that would otherwise be impossible, particularly for women whose movements were more strictly controlled than those of men. The use of maritime escape routes was particularly important for those fleeing the Spanish and Portuguese Inquisitions. Merchants, sailors, and others with access to ships developed sophisticated networks for smuggling refugees to safety in North African ports, Italian city-states, or Protestant territories in Northern Europe. These maritime escape routes often involved considerable risks, as discovered refugees could be handed over to inquisitorial authorities at any port under Catholic control. Family-based escape networks were often particularly effective because they combined strong motivational bonds with practical resources and knowledge. The case of the Luna family, Aragonese conversos who organized a systematic immigration of over 50 family members to the Ottoman Empire over a period of 15 years, demonstrates how extended kinship networks could coordinate long-term resistance strategies that gradually moved entire family systems beyond inquisitorial reach. Countries that offered refuge. The Ottoman Empire emerged as perhaps the most significant refuge for those fleeing inquisitorial persecution, particularly for Jews and conversos who could find relatively tolerant conditions under Islamic rule. Sultan Bayezid II famously welcomed Jewish refugees from Spain after 1492, recognizing that their skills in commerce, medicine, and administration would benefit his empire. The Ottoman approach to religious minorities, while not without discrimination, was generally more tolerant than Catholic policies, allowing refugees to maintain their religious practices while contributing to imperial economic and cultural development. The major Ottoman cities of Constantinople, Thessalonica, and Izmir became centers of refugee communities that preserved the languages, customs, and religious practices of their countries of origin while adapting to their new circumstances. These communities developed sophisticated networks that continue to help new refugees escape from Catholic territories for centuries after the initial waves of migration. The preservation of Ladino, Judeo-Spanish, in Ottoman Jewish communities provides linguistic evidence of this cultural continuity across generations of exile. Venice and other Italian city-states provided complex and sometimes contradictory refuge opportunities for those fleeing inquisitorial persecution. While Venice had its own Inquisition and was officially Catholic, the city's commercial interests often took precedence over religious orthodoxy, creating opportunities for refugees who could contribute to Venetian economic prosperity. The Venetian government frequently protected converso merchants and other refugees whose skills were valuable to the city's commercial empire, sometimes in direct defiance of papal demands for their extradition. The Venetian approach to refugee protection was typically pragmatic rather than ideological. Refugees who could establish themselves as successful merchants, skilled craftsmen, or useful professionals were often allowed to remain and practice their trades, though they might be required to conform outwardly to Catholic practices. This pragmatic tolerance created a model that was followed by other Italian commercial centers, including Genoa, Florence, and Naples, which competed for the economic benefits that skilled refugees could provide. Protestant territories in Northern Europe, particularly after the Reformation, became increasingly important destinations for Catholic refugees fleeing inquisitorial persecution. The Netherlands, which was fighting for independence from Spanish rule, actively welcomed refugees as both potential allies against Catholic power and valuable contributors to Dutch economic development. The Dutch policy of religious tolerance, while not absolute, was significantly more liberal than Catholic alternatives and attracted thousands of refugees throughout the 16th and 17th centuries. Amsterdam became particularly famous as a refuge destination, earning the nickname New Jerusalem for its large and prosperous Jewish community composed largely of refugees from the Spanish and Portuguese Inquisitions. The city's religious tolerance, commercial opportunities, and protection from Catholic authorities made it an ideal destination for those seeking to escape persecution while rebuilding their lives and communities in safety. England's relationship with inquisitorial refugees was complex and evolved significantly over time. Under Catholic rulers, England was not a safe destination for those fleeing Catholic persecution. However, after the English Reformation, and particularly during the reign of Elizabeth I, England became increasingly welcoming to Protestant refugees fleeing Catholic persecution, while remaining suspicious of Catholic refugees who might be fleeing for political rather than religious reasons. The English approach to refugee protection was heavily influenced by political considerations related to conflicts with Catholic powers, particularly Spain. English policymakers recognized that supporting refugees could serve both humanitarian and strategic purposes, providing sanctuary for those fleeing persecution while gathering intelligence about Catholic institutions and potentially recruiting allies in ongoing conflicts with Catholic powers. France presented a paradoxical situation for refugees fleeing inquisitorial persecution. While France was officially Catholic and had its own forms of religious persecution, conflicts between French and Spanish political interests sometimes created opportunities for Spanish refugees to find protection in France. French policy toward refugees was typically driven by political calculation rather than humanitarian concern, with protection offered when it served French interests in their ongoing conflicts with Spanish power. The establishment of Protestant communities in France, particularly the Huguenots, created additional complications for refugee policy. French Protestants sometimes provided assistance to refugees fleeing Catholic persecution, creating networks of mutual support that transcended national boundaries. However, French government persecution of domestic Protestants meant that these support networks operated at considerable risk and with limited effectiveness. Secret communities that persisted. The crypto-Jewish communities of the Iberian Peninsula represent perhaps the most remarkable example of successful long-term resistance to inquisitorial persecution. Despite centuries of systematic investigation and persecution, significant numbers of families maintained Jewish religious practices in secret while outwardly conforming to Christian requirements. These communities developed elaborate systems of coded communication, disguised religious observances, and mutual protection that allowed them to preserve their religious identity across generations of persecution. The persistence of crypto-Jewish practices required extraordinary dedication and ingenuity. Families developed methods for observing Jewish holidays and dietary laws that could be disguised as Christian activities or explained as medical necessities. The Sabbath was observed through subtle changes in household routines that would not attract outside attention, while major holidays were commemorated through family gatherings that appeared to be ordinary social events to outside observers. Religious education within crypto-Jewish communities was conducted through oral transmission and carefully coded written materials that could be hidden or destroyed if discovery threatened. Children were gradually introduced to their true religious heritage as they matured and demonstrated their trustworthiness, creating generational transmission of knowledge that preserved Jewish religious and cultural traditions despite constant danger of discovery and death. The Morisco communities of Spain, composed of Muslims who had been forced to convert to Christianity, also maintained secret religious practices that persisted long after their official conversion. These communities developed sophisticated methods for preserving Islamic religious knowledge, including the creation of al-Jamiato literature, Spanish texts written in Arabic script that preserved Islamic religious and cultural traditions while appearing innocuous to Christian authorities who could not read Arabic. Morisco resistance took many forms beyond simple religious observance. Some communities maintained connections with Muslim territories in North Africa, receiving religious guidance and sometimes coordinating escape efforts. Others developed internal religious leadership that provided guidance for religious observance while adapting Islamic practices to the constraints of life under Christian rule. The geographic isolation of some Morisco communities in mountainous regions of Spain provided additional protection from inquisitorial surveillance. These isolated settlements could maintain relatively open Islamic practices while developing early warning systems that allowed them to quickly assume Christian appearances when outside authorities approached. The persistence of these communities demonstrates how geographic factors could create spaces of relative freedom even within territories under intense inquisitorial control. Protestant communities in Catholic territories also developed successful strategies for long-term survival under persecution. The Waldensian communities in the Alpine regions of France and Italy maintained their distinctive religious practices for centuries despite periodic waves of persecution. Their geographic isolation, strong community bonds, and careful adaptation to changing political circumstances allowed them to preserve their religious identity while avoiding complete destruction. The Waldensian approach to survival involved careful balance between accommodation and resistance. They maintained their distinctive religious beliefs and practices while adapting their outward behavior to minimize conflict with Catholic authorities. This strategy required constant adjustment to changing political circumstances and careful assessment of when resistance was possible and when accommodation was necessary for survival. Secret Protestant communities in Spain, while smaller and less persistent than crypto-Jewish or Morisco communities, also demonstrated remarkable resilience in the face of systematic persecution. These communities, often centered around particular families or regions, maintained Protestant beliefs and practices through underground networks that connected Spanish Protestants with their co-religionists in other countries. Unsung heroes who helped the persecuted. The survival of persecuted communities depended heavily on the assistance of individuals who risked their own safety to provide aid to those fleeing or hiding from inquisitorial persecution. These helpers came from all levels of society and were motivated by various combinations of humanitarian concern, religious conviction, political opposition to the Inquisition, and personal relationships with those they aided. Christian clergy who disagreed with inquisitorial methods sometimes provided crucial assistance to refugees and hidden communities, despite the enormous risks to their own careers and safety. Some priests used their positions to provide advance warning of impending investigations, helped forge documents that would allow refugees to travel safely, or provided sanctuary in churches and monasteries that were nominally beyond inquisitorial reach. The case of Fray Luis de Leon, an Augustinian friar and professor at the University of Salamanca, illustrates both the possibilities and limitations of clerical resistance to the Inquisition. While never directly aiding refugees, his theological writings and teaching challenged some of the intellectual foundations of inquisitorial persecution, and his own imprisonment by the Inquisition demonstrated the risks faced by clergy who expressed even moderate criticism of institutional methods. Secular officials in positions of administrative authority sometimes use their power to protect individuals and communities from inquisitorial persecution. Local magistrates might delay the execution of arrest warrants. Customs officials might allow suspicious travelers to pass without investigation, and court officials might lose important documents or provide advance warning of planned actions. The motivations of these official helpers varied considerably. Some were motivated by humanitarian concerns or religious conviction, while others were influenced by bribery, family connections, or political opposition to central authority. Regardless of their motivations, their assistance was often crucial to the success of escape attempts and the survival of hidden communities. Merchants and traders played particularly important roles in refugee assistance networks due to their mobility, international connections, and access to transportation resources. Maritime merchants were especially valuable allies. as they could provide passage to safety in foreign ports, while their frequent travel made their involvement less likely to attract suspicion. The international character of medieval and early modern commerce created natural networks that could be adapted for refugee assistance. Merchants who traded between Catholic and non-Catholic territories were particularly well-positioned to help refugees escape, as their business activities provided cover for humanitarian assistance. Many merchant families developed reputations as reliable helpers, creating informal but effective refugee assistance networks that operated across national and religious boundaries. Professional groups sometimes organized collective resistance to inquisitorial persecution, particularly when their members were disproportionately targeted. Physicians, lawyers, and other educated professionals developed informal networks for mutual protection and assistance that could help members escape persecution or weather periods of intense investigation. The medical profession was particularly important in refugee assistance efforts, as physicians had both the mobility and the social status that allowed them to travel freely and assist refugees without attracting suspicion. Medical knowledge was also valuable for treating refugees who had been injured during escape attempts or who were suffering from the physical and psychological effects of persecution. Women played crucial but often unrecognized roles in refugee assistance networks, using their positions within household economies and social networks to provide aid in ways that were less likely to attract official attention. Nuns, particularly those in contemplative orders, sometimes provided sanctuary for women fleeing persecution, while wealthy widows used their economic resources to finance escape attempts and support refugee communities. The domestic nature of much women's assistance work meant that their contributions were often informal and undocumented, making it difficult for historians to fully assess their importance to refugee survival. However, the evidence that does survive suggests that women's networks were often crucial to the success of resistance efforts, providing both practical assistance and emotional support that enabled refugees to survive and rebuild their lives in safety. Ordinary citizens motivated by humanitarian concern or personal relationships also provided crucial assistance to persecuted individuals and communities. Neighbors who warned of approaching investigations, servants who carried messages between hidden communities, and strangers who provided food or shelter to refugees all contributed to the networks of resistance that made survival possible for thousands of people who would otherwise have perished under inquisitorial persecution. The motivations of these ordinary helpers remind us that resistance to institutional oppression often depends on the accumulated effects of countless small acts of courage and compassion. While their names are rarely recorded in historical documents, their contributions were essential to the survival of the communities and individuals who managed to escape or endure inquisitorial persecution. Their legacy serves as a reminder that even the most comprehensive systems of oppression can be challenged and overcome through human solidarity and mutual aid. Part 10. The Legacy of Fear. The enduring shadow of institutional intolerance. The formal abolition of the various Inquisitions, the Spanish in 1834, the Roman in 1908, marked an era, but not the end of their influence. Like deep roots that continue to nourish or poison the soil long after a tree has been cut down, the Inquisition's legacy permeates modern society in ways both obvious and subtle. To understand our contemporary struggles with religious freedom, tolerance, and the balance between security and liberty, we must first reckon with this dark inheritance. Lasting impact on society. The architecture of surveillance. Perhaps nowhere is the Inquisition's legacy more visible than in the development of systematic surveillance and control mechanisms. The Holy Office pioneered methods of social monitoring that would seem familiar to any student of totalitarian regimes. Their network of informants, detailed record-keeping, and presumption of guilt until proven innocent established templates that authoritarian movements would later adopt and refine. The Inquisition's bureaucratic machinery created what historian Henry Charles Lea called the first modern police state. Every aspect of daily life became subject to scrutiny. What people ate, how they prayed, whom they married, what books they read. This total surveillance system required ordinary citizens to become complicit in monitoring their neighbors, creating a culture of suspicion that outlasted the institution itself. Modern democratic societies continue to grapple with this tension between security and privacy. When governments implement mass surveillance programs, restrict freedom of movement, or encourage citizens to report suspicious behavior, they echo methods perfected centuries ago in the name of religious orthodoxy. The digital age has only amplified these capabilities, making the Inquisition's dream of total information awareness a technological reality, the weaponization of fear. The Inquisition understood that fear could be more effective than force in maintaining control. Public spectacles like the auto-da-fe served not merely as punishment, but as psychological warfare against potential dissidents. The message was clear: this could happen to you. This calculated use of terror as a governing tool left profound marks on the societies it touched. In Spain, the culture of limpieza de sangre, purity of blood, created a society obsessed with genealogical investigation and religious conformity. Families kept detailed records proving their Christian heritage for generations, even centuries, after the Inquisition's power had waned. The stigma of converso ancestry persisted well into the modern era, shaping Spanish attitudes toward religious and ethnic minorities. The psychological impact extended beyond immediate victims. Entire communities learned to self-censor, to perform orthodoxy even in private settings. This internalization surveillance created what Michel Foucault would later term disciplinary power, control exercised not through constant coercion, but through the mere possibility of observation and punishment. Economic and social stratification. The Inquisition's activities had profound economic consequences that reverberated for centuries. The expulsion of Jews from Spain in 1492, followed by waves of converso persecution, decimated communities that had been central to commerce, banking, and intellectual life. Similar patterns emerged wherever the Inquisition operated, creating economic disruptions that weakened entire regions. The confiscation of property from condemned heretics provided immediate revenue for the Inquisition and the crown, but also created perverse incentives. Wealthy individuals became targets not necessarily because of their beliefs, but because of their assets. This corruption of justice for financial gain established precedents that would echo through history in various forms of state-sanctioned theft. More subtly, the Inquisition's emphasis on religious conformity over merit contributed to economic stagnation. Innovation requires the ability to think differently, to challenge established ways of doing things. Societies that punished intellectual deviation found themselves increasingly unable to compete with more open cultures. Spain's decline from the heights of empire to European periphery cannot be attributed solely to the Inquisition, but the culture of conformity it fostered certainly played a role. How the Inquisition shaped entire cultures. The culture of secrecy. In regions touched by the Inquisition, secrecy became a survival skill. Families developed elaborate codes for discussing sensitive topics. Religious practices went underground, creating parallel cultures that persisted for generations. The crypto-Jews of the American Southwest, descendants of conversos who fled Spain, maintained hidden Jewish traditions for over 4 centuries, demonstrating the remarkable persistence of cultural memory under oppression. This culture of secrecy shaped more than religious practice. It affected how people related to authority, how they expressed dissent, and how they formed communities. Literature from Inquisition-era Spain is filled with coded messages, double meanings, and careful euphemisms, techniques that authors use to express dangerous ideas while avoiding persecution. The impact on intellectual culture was particularly severe. Universities, once centers of diverse thought and debate, became bastions of orthodoxy. The Index of Forbidden Books restricted access to new ideas from across Europe, creating intellectual isolation that persisted long after political restrictions were lifted. Spain's relative absence from the scientific revolution and the Enlightenment cannot be separated from the Inquisition's suppression of intellectual freedom, gender, and power dynamics. The Inquisition's treatment of women both reflected and reinforced patriarchal structures that shaped European society for centuries. Women accused of witchcraft, heresy, or sexual deviance faced particular scrutiny, their bodies and behaviors subject to intense regulation. The institution's obsession with female sexuality, from its pursuit of beatas, holy women, to its persecution of alleged witches, created lasting cultural anxieties about women's spiritual and social autonomy. The concept of honor, honra, that dominated Spanish society was intimately connected to control of women's sexuality and behavior. Families' social standing depended on the perceived virtue of their women, creating systems of surveillance and control that extended far beyond formal inquisitorial procedures. These cultural patterns influenced gender relations throughout the Spanish Empire and persisted long after the Inquisition's decline. Religious architecture and urban planning. The physical legacy of the Inquisition remains visible today in the urban landscapes of cities like Seville, Lima, and Mexico City. The massive tribunals, with their imposing facades and secure courtyards, dominated city centers, serving as constant reminders of ecclesiastical power. These buildings, many of which survive today as museums or government offices, shaped how entire cities developed and how citizens moved through urban space. The auto de fe required large public spaces for maximum theatrical impact. Plazas were designed or redesigned to accommodate these spectacles, creating urban layouts that prioritize the display of authority over commercial or social needs. The psychological geography of Inquisition cities reflected and reinforced hierarchies of power that extended far beyond religious matters. Historical lessons on intolerance. The gradual erosion of rights. One of the most important lessons from the Inquisition is how quickly societies can slide from tolerance to persecution. Medieval Spain had been a model of convivencia, coexistence, where Christians, Muslims, and Jews had lived together for centuries in relative harmony. The transformation to a society obsessed with religious purity did not happen overnight, but through a series of incremental steps, each seemingly justified by circumstances. The process began with voluntary conversion incentives, progressed to forced conversions, then to suspicion of convert sincerity, and finally to systematic persecution. At each stage, authorities presented their actions as necessary responses to external threats or internal corruption. This pattern, the gradual normalization of intolerance through appeals to security and purity, offers crucial insights for contemporary defenders of pluralistic democracy. The Inquisition demonstrates how legal frameworks can be corrupted to serve political ends. Initially established to address genuine concerns about religious unity and social stability, the institution quickly developed its own interests and momentum. Bureaucratic expansion, financial incentives, and political usefulness transformed a supposedly temporary emergency measure into a permanent feature of governance. The dangers of moral certainty. The Inquisitors genuinely believed they were saving souls and protecting society from corruption. This moral certainty, combined with institutional power, created a system immune to self-reflection or reform. Critics could be dismissed not merely as wrong, but as evil, eliminating the possibility of meaningful dialogue or gradual reform. This pattern recurs throughout history whenever institutions claim exclusive access to moral truth. The combination of righteousness and power creates dangerous conditions for the emergence of systematic oppression. The Inquisition's legacy warns us to be suspicious of any authority that claims to act in the name of absolute moral principles while refusing to subject its methods to scrutiny or debate. The importance of procedural safeguards. While the Inquisition developed elaborate legal procedures, these were ultimately subordinated to predetermined outcomes. The presumption of guilt, the use of secret witnesses, the acceptance of torture-induced confessions, and a conflation of investigation and prosecution created a system that virtually guaranteed conviction once proceedings began. Modern legal systems have developed safeguards specifically designed to prevent such abuses. The presumption of innocence, the right to confront accusers, protection against self-incrimination, and separation of prosecutorial and judicial functions. These protections emerge partly as conscious rejections of inquisitorial methods, representing hard-won wisdom about the conditions necessary for genuine justice. Reflections on freedom of thought and belief. The fragility of tolerance. The Inquisition's history reveals how fragile tolerance can be, even in societies with long traditions of pluralism. Tolerance is not a natural state, but an achievement that requires constant vigilance and renewal. It depends on institutions, legal frameworks, and cultural norms that could be eroded gradually or swept away suddenly during periods of crisis. The transformation of medieval Iberia from a model of religious coexistence to the epicenter of religious persecution demonstrates how quickly tolerance can collapse when fear overwhelms reason. Economic difficulties, political instability, and external threats created conditions where scapegoating and purification campaigns seemed attractive to both rulers and ordinary citizens. The value of dissent. The Inquisition's systematic suppression of dissent impoverished the societies it controlled. Innovation, whether technological, artistic, or intellectual, requires the ability to challenge established ways of thinking. Societies that punish deviation inevitably stagnate, becoming increasingly unable to adapt to changing circumstances. The contrast between Spain and the Netherlands during the early modern period illustrates this principle clearly. While Spain invested enormous resources in maintaining religious orthodoxy, the Netherlands welcomed religious refugees and fostered commercial and intellectual innovation. The long-term consequences, Spanish decline and Dutch prosperity, suggest that tolerance is not merely morally superior, but practically advantageous. The universal human yearning for freedom, perhaps the most remarkable aspect of the Inquisition's history, is not its success in suppressing dissent, but the persistence of human resistance to oppression. Despite centuries of persecution, crypto-religious communities maintain their traditions. Despite systematic censorship, ideas continue to spread. Despite torture and execution, people continue to think forbidden thoughts. The survival of the Chuetas in Mallorca, the persistence of crypto-Jewish traditions in the Americas, and the underground circulation of banned books all testify to an indomitable human spirit that refuses to be completely crushed. This resilience offers hope that even the most sophisticated systems of oppression ultimately fail to extinguish the human capacity for independent thought and belief. Contemporary relevance, modern parallels and warnings. While no contemporary institution exactly replicates the Inquisition, its methods and mindset persist in various forms. Authoritarian regimes continue to use religious or ideological orthodoxy to justify oppression. Democratic societies struggle with the tension between security measures and civil liberties. Social media creates new possibilities for both surveillance and the spread of extremist ideologies. The Inquisition's history offers specific warnings about dangerous patterns: the gradual erosion of legal protections, the weaponization of fear for political purposes, the corruption of religious or moral principles to serve power, and the creation of systems that reward denunciation and punish dissent. The ongoing struggle for religious freedom. Religious persecution continues throughout the world today, often employing methods that would be familiar to the inquisitors. The systematic oppression of Uyghur Muslims in China, the persecution of Christians in various countries, and the rise of religious nationalism in democratic societies all echo themes from the Inquisition's history. Understanding how the Inquisition operated, its methods, motivations, and ultimate failure, provides tools for recognizing and resisting contemporary forms of religious oppression. The institution's ultimate abolition demonstrates that even seemingly permanent systems of control can be overcome when people refuse to accept intolerance as inevitable. Conclusion: learning from history's shadows. The Inquisition's legacy is not merely a historical curiosity, but a living presence in contemporary debates about tolerance, security, and human rights. Its influence can be traced in legal systems, cultural attitudes, and institutional practices that persist centuries after the last auto da fe. More importantly, its history offers essential lessons about the conditions that enable oppression and the vigilance required to preserve freedom. The gradual transformation of medieval Spain from a model of coexistence to a byword for religious persecution demonstrates how quickly tolerance can collapse when fear overwhelms reason. The Inquisition's bureaucratic efficiency shows how ordinary people can become complicit in systematic oppression when institutional structures reward conformity and punish dissent. Yet the history also reveals the ultimate futility of attempts to control human thought and belief through force. Despite centuries of persecution, the human spirit's capacity for independent thought, cultural preservation, and moral resistance ultimately proved stronger than any system of oppression. The crypto-Jews who maintained their traditions in secret, the authors who embedded dangerous ideas in seemingly orthodox texts, and the ordinary people who refused to inform on their neighbors all testify to the enduring power of human dignity. The Inquisition's greatest lesson may be that the price of freedom is not merely eternal vigilance, but active resistance to the gradual normalization of intolerance. When authorities claim exclusive access to truth, when emergency measures become permanent, when denunciation becomes a civic duty, and when dissent is equated with disloyalty, the foundations of free society are under threat. Today, as democratic institutions face new challenges and religious conflict persists around the world, the Inquisition's history remains urgently relevant. Its shadow reminds us that tolerance is not a luxury but a necessity, that procedural safeguards are not technicalities but lifelines, and that the defense of others' rights is ultimately the defense of our own. In remembering the victims of the Inquisition and understanding the mechanisms of their oppression, we honor both their memory and our responsibility to ensure that such systematic intolerance never again finds fertile ground in human society. The legacy of fear that the Inquisition created need not be permanent. Through education, institutional reform, and cultural change, societies can overcome even deeply rooted patterns of intolerance. The Inquisition's history teaches us what to avoid. Our response to that history determines what kind of world we will build.